What if Itachi Uchiha woke up in the past before the Uchiha massacre, before Sasuke's life was destroyed, and before Naruto's darkest timeline could begin? In this alternate Naruto story, Itachi gets one final chance to rewrite history from the inside. This is a full cinematic retelling of a what-if Itachi time travel story where he secretly allies with Hiruzen, protects Naruto from early hatred, keeps the Uchiha integrated into Konoha, and starts changing the future one decision at a time. But saving the clan is only the beginning. As hidden root networks, political instability, Orochimaru's shadow, and larger threats start shifting across the shinobi world, Itachi realizes this is no longer just about stopping one tragedy, it is about building a new future strong enough to survive what comes next. If you love Naruto, what if? Stories Itachi Uchiha alternate timeline arcs. Uchiha massacre fix. It plots Itachi saves. Sasuke stories. Naruto time travel fanfiction, recaps and long-form cinematic anime storytelling. This is a deep emotional, high-stakes alternate universe journey through Konoha, the Uchiha clan. Team Uncle Hiruzen's political strategy, and the first signs of a much bigger war still waiting in the dark. What kind of man gets a second chance after becoming the villain in his own brother's story? Not a hero, not a saint, not someone clean enough to speak of fate like it owed him mercy. And yet, when Uchiha Itachi opened his eyes, mercy was exactly what he found waiting for him. At first, the wrongness came in pieces. The ceiling above him was too plain, too familiar. The air smelled faintly of old wood and clean tatami instead of blood, medicine, and the dust of battle. There was no weight pressing against his lungs, no failing body, no slow collapse from illness prolonged beyond reason. He remembered Kabuto. He remembered the cold certainty of the Edo Tensei. He remembered talking to Sasuke at last with nothing left to hide, nothing left to protect, nothing left but truth. He remembered release, peace, the final loosening of every burden he had carried through life and death. So why was he breathing? He did not move right away. For one long, suspended moment, he let his thoughts arrange themselves around the impossible. Dead men did not wake in beds. Dead men did not feel blankets against their skin or morning air against their face. Dead men, if there was any justice in the world at all, did not get called back after all the things they had done. Then he opened his eyes. A plain ceiling, a wall, a room. And on that wall, bright and unmistakable even through the haze of confusion, the Uchiha fan. He sat up too quickly and nearly forgot how to breathe. His gaze dropped to his hands. They were small, not merely younger, not merely healed. Small in the humiliating, undeniable way only a child's hands could be. The fingers were shorter, the wrists thinner, the skin untouched by years of training, violence, and disease. He stared at them with a stillness so complete it bordered on horror. Somewhere in the back of his mind, instinct urged calm, panic later, information first, survive first, understand first. He stood, and the room shifted around him. No, not the room, his height. The furniture loomed slightly higher than it should have. The world had stolen inches from him. It took him only a few slow steps to realize what his eyes had not yet fully accepted. He knew this room, knew the bed, the wardrobe, the placement of the window, the old grain in the floorboards. This was not merely an Uchiha room. This was his room, his childhood room. His pulse did not quicken. It seemed to vanish altogether. He crossed into the bathroom with measured steps that felt as if they belonged to somebody else, and when he raised his eyes to the mirror, the final illusion collapsed. A child stared back at him. The face was his, softer, smaller, untouched by the lines that grief and guilt had carved into it. The dark hollows beneath his eyes were not yet earned. The weight in his expression looked monstrous on a face so young. For a second he could only stare. Then training overrode shock. He closed his eyes and reached inward, toward chakra, toward structure, toward truth. No distortion, no foreign interference, no genjutsu. What he found instead was somehow worse. Reduced reserves, sharp control, a body rewound to a point where power existed mostly as memory. He opened his eyes and let the Sharingan bloom almost reflexively, then pushed further, testing the Mangekyo with a recklessness born from necessity. The world sharpened. His vision did not blur. The room remained the room. And the sudden drain ripping through his chakra told him that whatever nightmare or miracle this was, it was real enough to kill him if he was careless. He cut the technique off at once, leaned against the wall, and let the truth settle into him piece by piece. He was in the past. It sounded absurd even inside his own mind. Time travel belonged in the category of impossible things, the same place as resurrection and talking to the dead. But he had seen the dead return. He had been one of them. The world had long ago forfeited the right to demand that he believe only in sensible things. So he stood there in the body of a child and took stock of the ruin and possibility before him. If this was real, then the clan was still alive. If this was real, then his parents still breathed. If this was real, then Sasuke had not yet learned hatred from his brother's hand. That thought hit harder than his own reflection had. Sasuke? Not the older brother he had left behind in war and ash and revelation, but the child, the baby. The boy with open eyes and unbroken trust, still waiting somewhere in this house or another room or another moment to be held by a brother who had not yet become a ghost wearing a man's face. His knees nearly gave then, nearly. Because along with hope came the old verdict, the one he had never escaped. Why him? Out of all the dead littering the history of shinobi villages, out of all the better men and kinder women and children who had never been allowed to grow old, why him? He had murdered his clan. He had served monsters. He had turned his own life into a weapon and called it duty. Even when his reasons had been noble, his hands had still done unforgivable things. No one looking at the ledger of his life would have chosen him for redemption, and yet someone, or something, had. Before he could press that question further, he heard the soft sound of a door sliding open and a woman's voice call his name, his mother. No illusion in the world could have prepared him for that. The voice reached through years of blood and distance and landed with unbearable gentleness inside his chest. He was not ready. For battle? Yes. For death? Yes. For this? No, never this. So he did the only thing his instincts allowed. He fled. The window opened. A body half the size he remembered moved with all the ingrained precision of a lifetime spent mastering control. His reserves were smaller, his frame weaker, but refinement did not vanish with youth. He crossed distance quickly enough to escape the house and the sound of her voice, landing far enough away to claim solitude, but not far enough to stop hearing his own thoughts. For 3 days, those thoughts gave him no peace. He learned the shape of the new world by watching it. The village still bore the scars of the Nine Tails attack. Reconstruction had begun, but grief still sat openly on the streets, in the lowered voices of civilians, in the hurried footsteps of shinobi, in every patched roof and half-rebuilt wall. The dead had not yet settled into memory. Their absence was still fresh enough to feel like weather, and in the middle of that fragile recovery, Itachi built his plan. There were many things wrong with the world he had left behind, more than one man could fix, more than one life could repair. But there were 3 truths around which everything else arranged itself with painful clarity. The Uchiha massacre must never happen. Akatsuki must be stopped before it became the nightmare that swallowed nations. Sasuke must be allowed to live as something other than the survivor of his brother's decision. Everything else came second. He knew there would be easier causes to champion, nobler priorities, perhaps, larger calculations. But for once in all his lives, Itachi chose selfishness and did not apologize for it. Saving the clan was selfish. Saving Sasuke was selfish. Loving them enough to rebuild the entire future around their survival was selfish too. Then so be it. He needed help. Power alone would not save the Uchiha. Not with his current body, not with years still standing between this moment and the forces already moving in shadow. He could not dismantle conspiracies from inside a child's room, could not prepare Konoha for Madara, Obito, Akatsuki, and everything else to come by acting alone. The only person with enough reach to matter immediately was the Hokage. Hiruzen Sarutobi had to know. That decision created another problem. How did a 5-year-old boy secure a private meeting with the leader of the village in the middle of post-disaster reconstruction? Not as the Uchiha heir, not as a promising child, as someone carrying forbidden knowledge from a future soaked in avoidable death. He watched, waited, remembered. The Hokage still took walks through the village when he could, brief escapes from paperwork and rebuilding. Public moments. Guarded moments, not safe for speech, not safe for truth. Ordinary genjutsu would fail. The Hokage would break it, or his guards would. Anything too slow would expose him before he had a chance to explain. Only one technique could bridge the gap between impossibility and opportunity. Tsukuyomi. The risk bordered on idiocy. In this body, with these reserves, even a single use would cost nearly everything. He would likely collapse the moment it ended. But if it worked, time itself could be bent inside the illusion. Minutes outside, hours within. Long enough to tell the truth, long enough to show it. Long enough to put the future into the hands of one old man before the world made its worst mistakes all over again. So on the 5th day after the Nine Tails attack, Itachi stood in a side street near the Hokage's route and waited. When Hiruzen came into range, Itachi stepped forward at exactly the right moment, just enough to draw the man's attention without alarming anyone else. A near collision, a turn, a glance upward. Red eyes met older, watchful ones. And Itachi, wearing the body of a child in the burden of a ruined life, opened the gate to his second beginning. The world vanished in an instant. One moment, Hiruzen Sarutobi was stepping aside to avoid a child in the street, and the next he was standing alone in a version of that same road so still and empty it felt carved out of silence itself. No civilian voices, no shinobi footfalls, no distant hammering from reconstruction crews. Just a frozen imitation of Konoha, stripped of movement, stripped of sound, stripped of time. And in front of him stood a stranger. Not a child this time, but a young man with long black hair, dark eyes that looked far older than his face, and the unmistakable features of the Uchiha clan. There was something immediately wrong with the picture, something the seasoned instincts of a shinobi caught before the conscious mind could name it. The man stood too straight for someone making a demand, too still for someone bluffing, too tired for someone young. Then the stranger bowed his head just slightly and spoke with the kind of measured courtesy that made the entire situation even more unsettling. "Please forgive the rude method, Hokage-sama. I did not see another way to speak with you without interruption. What I have to say is important enough that I ask only one thing of you before you judge me. Listen." Hiruzen had been a shinobi for too long to let shock control him. His first thought was to break the genjutsu. His second was to observe. There was no panic in the stranger's voice, no theatrical edge, no triumph. If anything, he sounded exhausted before the conversation had even begun. "Who are you?" Hiruzen asked. The man's gaze did not waver. "Uchiha Itachi." The answer hung in the air. For the first time in a very long life, Hiruzen found himself truly at a loss. He had just looked into the eyes of a 5-year-old boy in the street. The figure before him was no child, but the resemblance was undeniable now that it had been named. The same structure around the eyes, the same cold discipline, the same eerie composure, only matured into something far more dangerous, or far more broken. "You expect me," Hiruzen said slowly, "to believe that the child I just saw is somehow also the man standing in front of me now." "Yes. That is a remarkable claim." "It would be less remarkable," Itachi said, "if I had the luxury of making a different one." There was no sarcasm in it, no edge, just bleak honesty. Hiruzen folded his hands behind his back, then explained. And so, Itachi did. Not all at once. Not with wild declarations or impossible speeches. He began exactly where a man like Hiruzen would need him to begin, with verifiable truths. The details of his room before the clan relocation. The aftermath of the Nine-Tails attack. The hidden condition of the village leadership. Names, timings, internal discussions a child should not know. He laid down fact after fact with the precision of someone building a bridge over a chasm, each plank placed carefully enough that the next one could bear weight. Hiruzen listened. Skepticism did not leave him, but it changed shape. It was no longer dismissal. It became the far more dangerous skepticism of a leader recognizing that something impossible might also be true. Then, Itachi took the final step and showed him. Tsukuyomi twisted. The empty street darkened and reformed into fragments of futures that had not yet happened. Not abstract visions, not symbolic nightmares, memories. The Uchiha district drowned in blood and silence. A younger Sasuke standing beneath a moonlit sky with eyes too wide to understand what his world had become. A masked man in shadow. Akatsuki, the weight of hidden wars moving beneath the skin of the continent. Hiruzen saw enough to understand that he was no longer dealing with a child prodigy, nor with a prank, nor with an ordinary warning. He was looking at the testimony of someone who had survived the collapse of everything he was now sworn to protect. And through it all, one image returned more than any other. Sasuke. A child first, then a boy, then something sharp with hatred and grief, carved hollow by a single night no village should ever have allowed to happen. Hiruzen had weathered war, he had buried comrades. He had seen the machinery of shinobi villages grind children into weapons and call it necessity. But there was something uniquely terrible about witnessing a future where the destruction of one clan became the seed of an entire generation's suffering. When the vision receded, the old man remained silent for a long while. Itachi did not interrupt him. He stood as one condemned man before one judge, though in truth both of them knew judgment alone would be useless here. The future Itachi described was too large for outrage and too intimate for abstraction. It was not just politics. It was not just war. It was one terrible decision breeding 10,000 others until a continent bled from wounds inflicted in secret rooms. At last Hiruzen asked, "Did you do it?" Itachi knew exactly what he meant. Yes, no justification followed. No attempt to soften the shape of the answer. "I killed the clan." Hiruzen's face hardened with grief so deep it almost looked like age settling onto him all at once. Why? And then came the explanation Itachi had dreaded most. Not because it was difficult to recount, but because speaking it aloud made him feel once again like both traitor and witness. He spoke of the fracture between the Uchiha and the village, of fear, surveillance, exclusion, resentment sharpened year after year, of the coup that had nearly become inevitable, of Danzo, of pressure disguised as strategy, of a choice presented in the language of necessity until murder could masquerade as duty. He did not spare himself in the telling. When he spoke of choosing the village over the clan, there was no pride in it. When he spoke of sparing Sasuke, there was no claim to nobility. When he spoke of joining Akatsuki afterward, of years spent killing and serving among monsters in the name of a greater balance, the words came out flat and precise, each one another stone laid upon a grave that had never properly closed. I believed, he said, that if I carried enough hatred alone, others might be spared from war. He paused. I was wrong. That, more than anything else, seemed to reach Hiruzen. Not the impossible mechanics of time, not even the massacre itself. The wrongness of intention sharpened the tragedy. The image of a prodigy shaped so thoroughly by village logic that he could become executioner and still believe he was preserving peace. The Hokage's voice, when it came again, was quieter. And now? Now I know where those roads end. That answer changed everything, because now this was no longer merely a confession. It was a strategic opportunity wrapped in moral catastrophe. Hiruzen could see it clearly. If this truly was the future return to flesh, then Konoha had been handed a map through its own disaster years before disaster arrived. Names, methods, hidden threats, fractures inside the village, the masked manipulator behind the nine tails, the eventual formation and escalation of Akatsuki, the failures that led Naruto into loneliness and the Uchiha into rebellion. A leader would have been a fool not to use such knowledge. A man would have been monstrous not to hesitate. Hiruzen closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, the hesitation was still there, but it had been joined by resolve. Tell me everything, he said. So Itachi did. He spoke of Naruto first, because in some ways Naruto represented the simplest cruelty in the old timeline, a child condemned by rumor, not policy. A savior turned scapegoat before he could even speak for himself. Itachi explained what Naruto became, how vital he would be, how much damage had been done by isolation, and how much of that damage might yet be prevented if the village never let hatred settle around him in the first place. Then he moved outward. The Uchiha had to remain integrated into village life. Suspicion could not be allowed to harden into policy. They could not be pushed to the margins where grievance could ferment in isolation. Visibility mattered, respect mattered, inclusion mattered. Small administrative decisions mattered because resentment was never born from one single act. It was accumulated grain by grain until one day it became irreversible. Hiruzen listened like a man reading a war report written in blood. When Itachi named Danzo, the silence that followed was colder than anger. The Hokage had known his old comrade for too long to be innocent about him. But knowing a man was dangerous and hearing what that danger would eventually become were not the same thing. Danzo in the future Itachi described was not merely ruthless. He was parasitic, feeding on instability, exploiting secrecy, and elevating preservation of the village into something so distorted it devoured the very people it claimed to protect. Hiruzen asked questions then, sharp ones, the kind only a leader asks when he has chosen to believe just enough to become dangerous. What could be changed immediately? Who could be trusted? How much of the future was fixed, and how much would shift the moment they took action? Which names must remain secret? Which mistakes had to be avoided first, before any larger plans were made? Itachi answered as best he could, but he did not pretend to certainty where there was none. The moment they began altering events, he warned, the future would stop matching his memories perfectly. Knowledge would remain useful, but not infallible. Every correction might generate a new problem. Every averted disaster could open a road no one had seen before. Hiruzen almost smiled at that, though there was no joy in it. In other words, he said, we are being asked to navigate a forest with a map that changes each time we take a step. Yes. And yet it is still more than we had. Yes. That simple exchange became the foundation of their alliance. Not trust, not fully. Trust would take longer than one conversation inside stolen time. But recognition, certainly. Recognition that the village's future now depended on an impossible partnership between its Hokage and a child carrying the mind of a man who had once become one of its darkest secrets. By the time the framework of a plan began to form, Itachi could feel the cost of Tsukuyomi closing around him like a vice. Chakra drained from him so thoroughly that even standing still inside the genjutsu felt like balancing at the edge of collapse. He hid it as long as he could. Old habits. Endure first, weaken later. Still, Hiruzen noticed. You are reaching your limit. Itachi did not deny it. The Hokage studied him for a moment, and in that final pause before the illusion would break, his expression shifted into something Itachi could not quite name. It was not pity, not forgiveness, something sterner but gentler too. When this ends, Hiruzen said, you will return home. Itachi's face gave away nothing, but something inside him flinched. You will speak to no one of this except me, unless I permit it. You will continue as a child, Because for now, that is what the village must see. I will begin making changes where I can do so without exposing our hand. And you? He stopped, as if choosing the next words carefully. You will not decide alone what burdens must be carried this time. For the first time since waking in the past, Itachi felt something dangerously close to disbelief. He had spent an entire lifetime carrying impossible burdens because no one had stopped him, because adults had looked at his capability and mistaken it for permission. The idea that someone might place limits on him not out of distrust, but out of responsibility, was so foreign that it nearly unbalanced him more than the chakra loss. He lowered his head. As you wish, Hokage-sama. The world shattered. Sound returned first, then motion. Then the ordinary street, the ordinary day, the ordinary flow of civilians passing near the Hokage without any awareness that less than a second ago, the future of the village had been quietly rearranged between two pairs of eyes. Hiruzen moved on. So did Itachi. Only after he turned down a side alley and felt the walls close around him did his body finally collect the debt it was owed. His vision narrowed. His legs gave once. He caught himself against stone. Then again, the child's body could not absorb what the man's will demanded of it. He slid downward in the shadow of the alley, barely conscious long enough to note one final fact with bitter practicality. At least he had made it somewhere private. Darkness took him. When he woke, the sun had already moved. For a moment, disorientation gripped him. Not from fear, but from the simple shock of being alive twice in 1 week. Then memory settled back into place. The meeting, the plan, the fact that Hiruzen had believed him, it was done. Not the future, not the saving, not the repair, but the first impossible step had been taken. He was no longer alone inside the knowledge of what was coming. And for the first time since opening his eyes in the past, Itachi allowed himself to think the thought fully. The future can be changed. It was a dangerous hope, the kind that, once admitted, could become more painful than despair if it failed. But there in the alley, weak, hungry, and trembling from chakra exhaustion, he let it live for a moment anyway. Then he pushed himself upright. He still had to go home. And somehow that frightened him more than speaking to the Hokage had. Home should have been simple. It was not the kind of battlefield that required strategy maps, covert signals, or impossible genjutsu. It did not carry the scale of Akatsuki, the poison of Danzo's influence, or the catastrophic weight of a village choosing fear over trust. It was only a house, a family, a dinner table, warm lights spilling across wood floors, the low sounds of domestic life settling into evening. And yet when Itachi stepped through the doorway that night, he felt more exposed than he had standing before the Hokage, with the whole future balanced on a lie that happened to be true. He removed his sandals with careful hands and announced himself in the calm, level voice expected of him. I'm home. His mother appeared almost immediately, framed in the doorway to the living room, beautiful in the devastatingly ordinary way only memory could make unbearable. She looked younger than the last version of her he had carried in his mind, of course. Softer, less burdened, untouched by the final calm with which she had once faced death at her son's hands. There were no shadows of suspicion in her eyes, no terrible acceptance, no love sharpened into farewell. Only concern. You're just in time for dinner, she said, then paused, studying him more closely. Itachi, you look exhausted. The irony nearly made him laugh, which would have been far stranger than silence. Instead, he lowered his gaze with perfect obedience. I overdid my training. It was not even fully a lie. Tsukuyomi, in a child's body, counted as overdoing something by any sane standard. But the excuse had edges polished in advance, ready for use the moment necessity demanded it. His mother sighed, that quiet, familiar sigh that belonged to the thousand small worries of parenthood rather than great historical tragedies. You've been pushing yourself too much lately. Your body is still adjusting. Just because your eyes awakened early doesn't mean you should treat yourself like you're already grown. Already grown, if she only knew. I'm sorry, Ka-san. For a moment, some part of him feared she would come closer, touch his forehead, search his face too carefully, and find the old soul crouched where a child should have been. But mothers did not need supernatural insight to sense when something was wrong. They merely needed to love enough, and sometimes that was the more frightening power. Still, after another look, she let it go. Wash up, she said. Your father's waiting, and please rescue Sasuke before he decides your otosan is a personal insult. The words landed lightly, almost teasing, and something inside Itachi shifted at once. Sasuke? No matter how exhausted he was, no matter how strained his chakra system felt, that name still moved through him like both pain and relief. He obeyed at once, crossing into the dining room where Fugaku sat with all the rigid dignity of a clan head forced into a task for which no battlefield had prepared him. In his arms was baby Sasuke, squirming with the offended energy unique to infants who know, without needing language, that they have been mishandled. The sight was so absurdly gentle that it nearly undid him. He stepped forward and took Sasuke with practiced ease. Instantly, the child settled, the tiny body fit against him with a familiarity that seemed to leap across timelines. Sasuke blinked up at him with bright, trusting eyes, unaware of anything except that his brother was here and therefore the world made sense again. That trust hit harder than any accusation ever had. In another life, he had broken it with surgical precision. He had stood over the ruin of their family and weaponized love itself. He had fed hatred into the one person whose happiness he should have protected above all others, then spent years pretending that was sacrifice instead of failure. Now Sasuke yawned against his chest, and the room, for one perfect second, felt quiet enough to believe in. Then Fugaku spoke. "I'm told you trained alone again." There it was, the true dinner table. Not warmth without pressure, but warmth braided together with expectation. His father's voice carried no open anger, only that stern precision which made every answer feel like a test before it was even given. Yes. And? A simpler man might have asked why. Fugaku asked for results. Itachi had forgotten neither the pattern nor the logic of it. Concern, in his father, often arrived dressed as evaluation. "My control held," he said carefully, "but the speed of my body is still lagging behind what my eyes can process." The answer pleased Fugaku more than apology would have. Pride moved beneath the man's restraint at the very mention of Itachi's early Sharingan, even if discipline kept it from showing too openly. That is to be expected. Perception develops faster than the body learns to obey it. You awakened with full tomoe. Naturally, there will be an adjustment period. Natural. As if anything about this was natural. Still, Itachi dipped his head. "I understand. Tomorrow," Fugaku continued, "we will train together." A command, not an offer. Itachi accepted it at once, though the idea carried 1,000-layered complications. Training with Fugaku meant more time spent in the direct orbit of one of the men he had once killed, more chances to witness the father before politics and resentment calcified around him, more chances to be reminded that history did not break people all at once. It altered them slowly, by pressure, by humiliation, by repeated proof that neither trust nor belonging would be freely given. It also meant something much simpler and far crueler, more time he had not earned. He nodded. "Yes, Oto-san." Dinner continued. Mikoto arrived with the meal, moving around the room with the effortless grace of someone who had performed the same motions 1,000 times and expected to perform them 1,000 more. Fugaku spoke little. Mikoto filled the quieter spaces with small observations. Sasuke alternated between drowsy contentment and determined attempts to claim Itachi's full attention. The whole thing unfolded with such unbearable normalcy that Itachi found himself focusing on practical tasks, lifting a spoon, adjusting Sasuke's blanket, lowering his eyes at the correct moments, simply to keep from staring too long at what should not have been possible. This, he thought, was what peace looked like before anyone knew they were about to lose it. The danger of peace was not that it made people weak, it was that it made memory unbearable. By the time dinner ended, Itachi had recovered enough physical steadiness to stand without fear of collapsing, but the deeper strain remained. He had crossed the threshold that day. The future was no longer locked solely inside his own mind. Hiruzen knew. Plans were already beginning. Tiny, almost invisible ones perhaps, but history rarely announced its first surrender. It merely started leaning a different way. The first evidence came sooner than he expected. The memorial service for the victims of the Nine Tails attack should have felt like a repetition of known pain. In his old life, it had also been the stage on which one more seed of cruelty was planted. Naruto had been displayed there, not as a child to be protected, but as a symbol to be managed, a vessel introduced to a grieving village in the worst possible atmosphere, a savior presented to people still desperate for something to blame. It had been one of those decisions that looked administrative from far away and monstrous up close. This time, Naruto was absent. To most people, that absence meant nothing. The memorial was still full of mourning families, shinobi in black, smoke drifting into the sky, and the heavy communal silence that follows disaster. The third Hokage still gave his speech. The dead were still honored. Tears were still shed by people whose lives had been split cleanly into before and after. But Itachi noticed. He stood among the Uchiha and felt the shape of the first correction settle quietly into place. No one pointed at a blonde infant and whispered about monsters. No old fear attached itself to a child too young to understand words. No public performance turned grief into prejudice quite so efficiently as before. Hiruzen had listened. It should have been a small relief. Instead, it felt enormous. Then the Hokage made a second change. In his speech, he thanked the Uchiha openly for their role during the attack. protecting civilians, guiding people to shelters, acting in defense of the village rather than against it. Again, to an outsider, the words might have seemed like routine acknowledgement. To Itachi, they sounded like a blade cutting through one of the future's oldest infections before it could spread. Rumors survived where silence permitted them. Suspicion hardened when institutions left room for it. A public statement from the Hokage would not erase every prejudice, but it altered the terms under which those prejudices would have to grow. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. Itachi stood in funeral black with his clan at his side and realized something almost frightening. The village could be steered, not perfectly, not cleanly, but steered. He did not let hope show on his face. Nearby, another figure drew his attention. Kakashi, standing alone with the kind of stillness that only grief could teach. Minato dead. Kushina dead. Team gone. Family gone. A life repeatedly hollowed out until duty was all that remained standing. In the previous timeline, Kakashi's path through the A and BU would harden him into something formidable and frayed all at once. Itachi knew what that would produce. A weapon, yes. A survivor, yes. But also another example of Konoha eating its wounded and calling it service. The problem with changing the future, he was beginning to understand, was that every person became a crossroads. Save one bond here, reroute one career there, reveal one truth too soon or too late, and the shape of an entire generation shifted around it. Then there was Orochimaru. At the edge of the gathering stood the Sannin, pale and watchful, his presence unsettling even before one knew what he would become. Hiruzen saw him too. Itachi could tell by the brief tension in the old man's posture. Another crossroads. Another choice stained by affection and danger. In one timeline, sentiment and hesitation had given Orochimaru room to descend fully into monstrosity before anyone acted decisively enough to matter. Would that happen again? Itachi did not know. Knowledge from the future was already becoming unstable. That was the price of success. The more they changed, the less reliable memory would become as prophecy. Itachi had expected that in theory. Standing there among smoke and mourning, he began to feel it in practice. Good, he told himself. A predictable tragedy was still a tragedy. After the memorial, the subtler work began. Hiruzen could not simply announce a new philosophy and expect old tensions to evaporate. The fracture between the Uchiha and the village had not been born from one insult or one bad decision. It had grown over years through exclusion, surveillance, rumor, pride, and the slow humiliation of being tolerated but not trusted. Reversing that required more than goodwill. It required policy disguised as practicality, and Hiruzen was clever enough to know it. The planned relocation of the Uchiha after the Nine Tails attack did not happen the way it had before. Instead of pushing the clan outward into a district that would deepen separation and resentment, the new arrangement kept them far closer to the center of village life, near the busiest commercial routes and the pulse of daily traffic. On paper, there were reasonable arguments for it. Better responsiveness from the police force, better access to high movement areas, better integration of security and commerce. The sort of bureaucratic language that made major social engineering sound like common sense. It worked. At first, many inside the clan disliked it. Privacy mattered to them. Distance preserved identity. The idea of civilians constantly passing through or near Uchiha territory offended the instinct towards separation that pride had sharpened over generations. But income had a way of changing opinions faster than philosophy ever could. Shops saw more traffic. Connections formed. People who might have remained abstract others became customers, neighbors, familiar faces. Even resistance inside the clan could not outlast practical advantage forever. Itachi watched it happen almost with disbelief. The old future had taught him to think in terms of catastrophic points: massacre, coup, war, defection, revelation. This new path forced him to appreciate the quiet power of ordinary contact. A district was not saved by speeches alone. Sometimes it was saved because merchants preferred profit over isolation, because children passed through shared spaces often enough to normalize one another, because walls became less effective when the flow of daily life kept crossing them. Danzo opposed it, of course. He opposed anything that reduced his control over narratives built from fear. But Hiruzen overruled him with the same calm administrative logic that had made the decision difficult to challenge openly. The military police, he argued, needed placement that allowed rapid movement through central village areas in an emergency. To disagree too strongly with that was to make one's suspicion of the Uchiha too visible. Danzo had many strengths. Public subtlety was one of them. Openly losing a political argument was another matter, so the change stayed, and the future, grain by grain, tilted further away from blood. Not all good news came from policy. Some of it emerged in silence. Weeks passed, then months. No rumors spread about Naruto being a demon child. No whispers reached academy halls. No adults glared at him with the strange mixture of fear and righteousness that had poisoned so much of his original life. Itachi did not fool himself into thinking Naruto's road would therefore become easy. A child orphaned in a shinobi village was still vulnerable to loneliness. But loneliness and systemic ostracism were not the same wound. One could be healed by bonds. The other taught a person to mistake pain for identity. That difference mattered. The strange thing was that none of these changes felt dramatic while they were happening. There was no single day on which Itachi could say, "This is the moment the massacre vanished. This is the moment Sasuke's future became safe. This is the moment all my sins stopped casting shadows." Instead, there were only adjustments. A memorial without Naruto. A speech that publicly honored the Uchiha. A district not banished to the margins. A silence where rumor should have been. But history was not only shaped by grand betrayals and legendary battles, it was also shaped by what never quite got started. By the time the months settled into a new routine, Itachi understood something he had not allowed himself to believe at first. The past was not asking him simply to stop disaster. It was asking him to build a world where disaster could no longer grow so easily in secret. That realization changed the nature of everything that followed. It meant the work before him was no longer only about prevention. Prevention was reactive. It waited for a threat to take shape and then tried to cut it down before it could strike. What he and Hiruzen were attempting now was more difficult than that. They were trying to alter the conditions that allowed those threats to flourish at all. A village less eager to isolate the Uchiha would be harder to turn against them. A Naruto not publicly marked as an object of fear would be harder to weaponize through neglect. A leadership forced to think in terms of inclusion instead of containment might yet avoid creating the enemies it later claimed it had no choice but to destroy. It was a wiser path. It was also a slower one. And slow change had a dangerous side effect. It left a man alone with his own mind. The grand tasks were bearable. Plans, surveillance, contingencies, the constant calculation of how much to say and how much to hide. Those things occupied him. They gave shape to his guilt. They translated memory into usefulness. When he was thinking about Akatsuki, Danzo, Naruto, or the clan's political future, he could almost believe he was more instrument than person, a blade placed carefully this time instead of swung wildly in the dark. The difficulty came in the empty spaces between those moments, in the pauses after training, when his body was cooling and his mind had nowhere urgent to go, in the quiet of the house, when Sasuke's laughter drifted from another room and every note of it reminded him what had once been taken. In the ordinary conversations with his mother, who worried when he skipped meals, adjusted his sleeves when they sat crooked, and smiled at him with no idea that she was loving a son who had already murdered her once. In the measured expectations of his father who saw a prodigy to shape an heir to prepare. A boy to test and refine, never suspecting that the child before him had already lived through the consequences of every flaw in that system. Normalcy, Itachi discovered, was far crueler than fear. Fear at least had direction. Normalcy asked him to live inside the very life he had shattered and behave as though he belonged there without hesitation. The next day, Fugaku took him to train. The training ground was quiet in the early light, marked by the familiar signs of repeated use, worn earth, scarred posts, old impacts carved into bark and wood. The kind of place where generations of shinobi had tested themselves until the land itself remembered discipline. Itachi stood opposite his father with the posture of a child trained too well to fidget, though internally he was adjusting not to the idea of training, but to the fact of who stood across from him. Fugaku was younger than the last version Itachi remembered, sharper, less buried beneath the tensions that would one day turn his every decision into a negotiation between clan resentment and paternal pride. There was still warmth in him, though it wore the same austere clothing as everything else he felt. It did not announce itself. It emerged in standards, in time given, and expectations framed as obligation because softer language came poorly to him. "Activate your Sharingan," Fugaku said. Itachi obeyed. Red replaced black. The tomo settled into place. Even now, even with all he knew, even with Mangekyo and death and war already behind him, the simple act of standing before his father with active Sharingan carried a strange emotional weight. In his first life, this had been a milestone, evidence of promise, proof that the clan had every right to expect greatness from him. In this one, it felt more like camouflage. He needed them to believe the change in him came from awakened eyes, not from a lifetime rewound. Fugaku circled him once, watchful. "You are adjusting too much through the eyes, and not enough through the body," he said at last. "You are seeing openings your frame cannot yet exploit. That delay will get you hurt." Itachi almost smiled at the understatement. Instead, he nodded. "Yes, Oto-san," again. They moved. To any observer, the exchange would have looked extraordinary for a child. To Itachi, it felt humiliating. Not because Fugaku outmatched him, of course he did in this body, but because memory kept offering options his muscles could not complete. Every angle suggested a response. Every shift in weight announced intention. The Sharingan gave him too much, and the body he wore could not cash the checks his perception kept writing. Again and again he was forced to stop short of what instinct demanded, reducing refined counters into blunt evasions, elegant attacks into awkward compromises. The frustration built quickly. Fugaku noticed that too. "Your face," he said. Itachi stilled. "Control it." Frustration clouds judgment. A younger Itachi might have heard that as mere correction. The man standing there now heard something more dangerous, truth spoken by someone who had no idea how often that lesson would later be used to justify silence, isolation, and unbearable choices. Control your face, control your voice, control your grief, control your fear. Keep refining, keep enduring, keep presenting composure until everyone around you mistakes endurance for readiness and hands you burdens that should never have been yours. He lowered his gaze for one measured breath, then raised it again with his expression smoothed back into place. "Yes, Oto-san." Training continued. By the end, his limbs trembled from effort his pride refused to acknowledge. Fugaku gave no praise in any ordinary sense, but he did not need to. The decision to keep training him personally, the precise nature of the criticism, the absence of dismissal, those were praise in his father's language. Itachi recognized it. Part of him even cherished it despite himself. That was the cruelty of love in the Uchiha household. It was there, it was simply built of difficult materials. As they walked back, Fugaku spoke without looking at him. "You are progressing well." Itachi felt the words more than he showed them. "But talent creates impatience," Fugaku continued. "If you let impatience rule you, talent becomes a liability, a warning, a lesson." A father trying, in the shape available to him, to guide a son he believed he still had time to raise. Itachi gave a small nod. "I understand." He did understand, more than Fugaku could know, more than he wished he knew. When they returned home, Sasuke was awake and immediately reached for him. That became the rhythm of the days. Training, study, observation. Careful conversations with Hiruzen when opportunities could be created. Quiet participation in a family life that felt both like blessing and accusation. And always, at the center of it, Sasuke. Baby Sasuke first, then toddler Sasuke, then a little boy with an endless capacity for trust and a deeply serious attachment to his older brother. Itachi had remembered the broad strokes of Sasuke's childhood, of course. The image of him chasing after acknowledgement, of fierce little declarations and solemn little hurts. What he had not remembered, what no memory had fully preserved, were the textures, the weight of him asleep against a shoulder, the tiny concentration on his face when he tried to copy something older children did, the way he would light up at being included in the smallest task, as if the world itself had become larger simply because Itachi had said yes. Those things were unbearable, those things were everything. Holding him often steadied Itachi more effectively than any meditation. It was difficult to spiral into abstract guilt, while Sasuke insisted on very immediate concerns like being carried, being shown, being praised, being kept close. There was something almost medicinal in the selfishness of children. They demanded presence, not philosophy, not repentance. Presence. And for all his plans about the village, about Madara, about Akatsuki, about saving the clan as a whole, the simplest and most sacred objective remained this: keep this child's eyes free of hatred for as long as humanly possible. That vow deepened the longer he lived beside him. It was not merely that Sasuke deserved better. That statement was obvious. It was that Sasuke, left unharmed, might become something entirely different from the boy and then young man forged by slaughter and lies. Without that wound at the center of him, who would he be? Not weaker, never that. Simply whole in a way the original timeline had denied him. For such a future, Itachi found he was willing to reshape anything. This included the way he handled others from his former life. Izumi entered that fragile piece like sunlight passing through leaves, gentle, constant, impossible to ignore once noticed. In one timeline, she had been a quiet affection he had never properly allowed himself to return before killing her with his own hands. In this one, she was simply there. A girl with warm eyes, quick emotions, and a habit of filling silence without seeming afraid of it. Their paths crossed naturally at first through clan functions and the academy. Then less naturally because she began seeking him out. Itachi did not stop her. He told himself the reason was practical. The more naturally connected he seemed to those around him, the less likely anyone was to suspect how deep the change in him actually ran. Which was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that after death and return, after ghost-filled dinners and strategy meetings with the Hokage, after carrying the knowledge of futures no one else could see, The presence of someone ordinary in her affection felt like a reprieve. Izumi talked. She talked about classmates, instructors, relatives, rumors too trivial to matter, meals she liked, arguments she'd had, ambitions she half boasted and half feared. She talked with the certainty that he would listen, and because he did listen, she talked even more. Itachi, who had never been overly verbal even before one life and one debt's worth of silence, settled permanently into him, mostly let her fill the air. He offered small replies, occasional observations, and from time to time the hint of a smile that seemed to delight her more than any elaborate conversation would have. He understood very early that her attachment to him was not neutral. She looked at him a little too long sometimes, grew flustered too quickly, took his attention as if it were both precious and somehow expected. In another circumstance, in another age, perhaps something gentler might have grown from that. But there was no universe in which the mind inside him could look at a child and answer a child's affection with romance. The thought itself felt wrong before it could even become thought. So he was careful, not cold. Not dismissive, just careful. Careful in where he placed distance. Careful in how much warmth he let show. Careful not to encourage futures that would ask of him an emotional honesty he was unequipped to offer. She deserved innocence no less than Sasuke did, and that meant protection not only from war and politics, but from being bound too tightly to someone who carried too much death under his skin. Even so, he spent time with her, sometimes because she asked, sometimes because he asked. That last fact troubled him more than he admitted. It meant part of him had already begun reaching toward the few people whose loss had once defined the edges of his regret. Sasuke, Shisui when the chance would come, Izumi now. It was not enough to save them in theory. He wanted, selfishly and terribly, to know them again, to build memories that did not end in blood, to hear voices that had once gone silent and answer them with something other than duty. If there was sin in that, he accepted it. Months passed quickly in the academy, though not because the lessons demanded anything from him. They were simple, almost insultingly so. Itachi had to expend more effort appearing appropriately engaged than he did mastering anything actually taught there. The real challenge lay in calibrating his performance. Too exceptional, and he would draw destabilizing levels of attention. Too ordinary, and he would waste time he no longer had the patience to waste. He threaded the line with precision. He answered when called on. He excelled without theatrics. He moved through the curriculum the way someone crossed a stream on stones they had memorized long ago. Teachers admired him. Students reacted with the predictable mixture of awe, irritation, admiration, and envy that prodigies always created. Itachi accepted all of it with the distant calm expected of an Uchiha heir whose temperament already leaned unsettlingly mature. In truth, the hardest part of the academy was not the material. It was pretending to be bored like a child instead of burdened like a man. Sometimes he stared out the window simply because looking too focused on elementary instruction would have been suspicious. Sometimes his mind wandered genuinely, but never far from purpose. He considered future threats, adjustments in village structure, the likely timing of shifts inside Akatsuki, the uncertain point at which Obito's attention might begin moving in new directions if the old ones no longer produced the same results. And sometimes, more quietly, he thought about who else might yet be saved if the pattern continued changing. Kakashi, perhaps, if the right support came before the A and BU hollowed him out. Naruto, if loneliness never calcified into a wound so deep it defined him. The Uchiha as a whole, if dignity and inclusion held. Maybe even people far beyond Konoha, though that path was murkier. Time had given him information, not omnipotence. He could not rescue everyone merely because he now knew where the fires would start. That truth sat heavily with him. Every saved person implied another not yet reached. Every success made the remaining dangers feel sharper by contrast. It was on one of those slow academy afternoons while an instructor demonstrated hand seals and his classmates struggled to keep up, that Itachi first felt the oddest emotion of all begin to take root beneath the guilt and strategy and vigilance. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. That word still felt too bright, too easy. But contentment, yes. The fragile, almost guilty peace of sitting in sunlight while knowing that for this brief stretch of time, no one was screaming, no one was dying, and no one expected him to choose between two unforgivable outcomes before nightfall. He hated how precious that feeling became, because it made clear what the first life had stolen from him even before the massacre, before Akatsuki, before illness and exile and lies. It had stolen the right to be young slowly. It had turned every talent into acceleration, every expectation into pressure, every sign of maturity into an excuse to demand more. Here, for fleeting moments, he was granted small pieces of that stolen thing back, Not because the world had become kind, but because he had returned with enough knowledge to hold disaster farther away than before. The danger, of course, was attachment. The more normal life became, the more there was to lose. He understood that better than anyone. And still, despite that understanding, he kept letting himself care. About the rhythm of evenings at home. About whether Sasuke had eaten enough. About whether Izumi seemed happier after spending time with him. About whether his mother's smile reached her eyes. About whether his father looked slightly less burdened when clan matters went smoothly. About whether the village, in all its flawed and fragile motion, might one day become worthy of the sacrifices people kept making in its name. That was the real beginning of his second life. Not the moment he woke in the past, not even the moment Hiruzen believed him, but the quieter and far more dangerous moment when he began wanting this world not only to survive, but to remain gentle. And once a man starts wanting that, he becomes vulnerable to losing it. That vulnerability revealed itself first in the smallest ways. A delayed footstep in the hall could tighten his chest before he consciously recognized why. A sharp noise in the street could draw his attention with the speed that had nothing to do with ordinary caution. The sight of Sasuke wandering too close to a staircase, or Mikoto stepping out later than expected, or Fugaku being called away for clan matters that carried even the scent of politics. Each of these could stir a response in him so immediate and intense that he had to hide it behind practiced stillness. That was the contradiction at the heart of his second life. He had come back with knowledge. Knowledge was supposed to create control. Control was supposed to calm fear. Instead, what it often did was refine fear into something more exact. In his first life, disaster had approached through uncertainty. In this one, he knew too many of the shapes catastrophe could take. Even where events had already begun changing, memory still lurked in the corners of his mind, ready to turn every delay into a warning and every shadow into a possibility. He managed it the only way he knew how, through routine. Routine steadied the mind. Routine gave the body tasks to inhabit when thoughts threatened to split open under their own weight. Wake, train, attend the academy, return home, study, spend time with Sasuke, listen to Izumi, observe the village, report what mattered, sleep if sleep came easily, begin again. And as the weeks passed, that routine carried him deeper into a truth he had not expected. Being a prodigy was exhausting in different ways when one had already survived the consequences of being one. In the academy, he moved through lessons with such effortless precision that even the instructors had begun to treat his excellence less as something to be encouraged than as a natural law to be accommodated. He answered correctly. He performed beyond expectation. He advanced faster than anyone around him. None of it required strain. The strain came from deciding how much of himself to reveal. Too much brilliance invited pressure. Too little wasted precious time. So he did what he had always done best. He calculated. He allowed enough excellence to justify movement through the system, but not enough to make himself unmanageable. He kept his posture attentive, his tone respectful, his face composed. If another student got something wrong, he did not make a display of correcting them unless called upon. If a teacher praised him, he accepted it without hunger. He let people see an Uchiha air of unusual maturity and skill. He did not let them see a dead man studying beginner material while trying not to think about civil war and masked conspirators. He had been moved ahead in the curriculum soon enough that the atmosphere around him changed. Among children his own physical age, a prodigy was often treated as an offense to the natural order. Among older students, he became something easier to categorize. Exceptional, yes, but distant enough from them that comparison lost some of its sting. They still noticed him. Some admired him. Some resented him quietly. Some simply accepted that every institution eventually produced one person around whom standards bent. That arrangement suited him. What did not suit him was the drag of time. No matter how well he concealed it, part of him was always chafing against delay. Every day spent reviewing concepts he had mastered years ago felt stolen from preparations that truly mattered. Akatsuki was not waiting politely for him to complete childhood. Neither was Obito. Neither were the countless small fractures in the shinobi world that would, left unattended, widen into disasters later. And yet impatience had ruined enough lives already. His father's warning on the training ground talent becomes a liability when ruled by impatience, stayed with him more than he liked to admit. Not because Fugaku had meant it in any grand philosophical sense, but because Itachi himself understood too well how easily capability could be mistaken for permission to move faster than wisdom allowed. So he endured the academy. He endured the boredom of lectures and the tediousness of exercises meant to teach others how to think in basic tactical patterns. He endured the strange experience of hearing adults explain village history, chakra theory, and shinobi ethics in clean academic language, while knowing firsthand how rarely reality honored such neat structures. He endured being looked at as a child genius rather than as what he actually was, a man trying to intercept the future that had once devoured everything he loved. And because endurance alone would have made the whole thing unbearable, he took what comfort he could from the peace built around it. That peace often wore Sasuke's face. By now, Sasuke was old enough to insist on following him when allowed, old enough to sulk when denied, old enough to experience every small act of inclusion as if it were a great personal victory. If Itachi sat down, Sasuke wanted to be beside him. If he practiced basic drills, Sasuke wanted to imitate him. If he left the room, Sasuke wanted to know where he was going and whether he would be back soon. It would have been easy to laugh at such devotion if it had come from anyone else. From Sasuke, it broke and healed him daily. There were moments when the younger boy's trust was so absolute, so instinctive, that Itachi almost could not bear to meet his eyes. Not because he feared being exposed, but because those eyes still carried the innocence he had once turned into a weapon. Here, now, they held only admiration. Certainty. The simple, sacred belief that an older brother existed to protect, to guide, to remain. Itachi intended to earn that belief this time. He trained Sasuke in tiny ways appropriate to his age. Not true shinobi instruction yet, but the foundations beneath it. Balance, focus, patience disguised as play. How to stand, how to watch, how not to let frustration immediately become self-rejection. Sasuke approached each lesson with fierce seriousness and equally fierce emotional volatility. When he succeeded, he glowed. When he failed, he took it as a personal betrayal by the universe. Watching that, Itachi often had to suppress the urge to go too far, too fast. Sasuke did not need to be sharpened early by fear. He did not need the world pressed upon him before childhood had done its work. Strength could come later. Wholeness had to come first. That same instinct toward careful preservation shaped his growing bond with Izumi. She found him after classes more often now, sometimes because she had arranged it beforehand, sometimes because she simply appeared with the certainty of someone who assumed he would not truly mind. Usually she was right. She brought movement into the spaces he might otherwise have filled with overthinking. Complaints about instructors, observations about classmates, stories that began nowhere important and ended nowhere important, which was perhaps exactly why he let her tell them. Importance had governed too much of his first life. There was a strange relief in listening to someone talk at length about a classmate's ridiculous habit, or a minor disagreement with a cousin, as though such things deserved real attention. In healthy lives, they did. The first time he recognized how deeply she feared losing proximity to him was the day she chased him after class, half annoyed and half breathless, because he had forgotten to wait. He knew the moment he heard her voice behind him, not only who it was, but the emotional rhythm of the encounter before it even began. Izumi's frustration was rarely pure frustration. It almost always sheltered something softer underneath, some worry she found easier to express through indignation than direct confession. He slowed and turned. She stopped in front of him, trying to look more offended than relieved. "Do you know how annoying it is to run after you?" "I apologize," he said. That only made her look more dissatisfied, which in turn nearly made him smile. Around most people, apology smoothed over discomfort. Around Izumi, they often sharpened it if the true issue had not yet been named. They walked together to the dango shop they had begun frequenting, one positioned near the edge of the Uchiha district and the broader commercial life of the village. Itachi liked that location more than he said. It embodied the new shape of things. Clan and village not separated by ideology made concrete, but touching, crossing, profiting from one another's ordinary existence. A small correction, a meaningful one. The owner knew them by now. They sat. Food arrived without much ceremony. And for once, Izumi went quiet. That was what made him pay close attention. Silence on her was like storm clouds over a familiar field. Not impossible, but always significant. He waited. She looked down at her lap, then away, then finally at him with an expression carrying far too much effort for someone so young. "You'll graduate tomorrow, won't you?" There it was. Not jealousy exactly. Not only that. Fear. He had expected graduation to change practical things. Team assignments, mission schedules, training demands. He had not fully accounted for what it would mean to a child whose attachment still followed the simple logic of proximity. To Izumi, graduation did not merely mean academic advancement. It meant separation. Distance. The possibility that someone important would move beyond the reach of her everyday life and not come back often enough to feel the same. For a moment, he saw the situation through her eyes and hated himself a little for not seeing it sooner. "Yes," he said, "I will take the exams." She gave a short, frustrated sound. "You say that like there's any doubt." He let that pass. The hard part was not understanding her fear. The hard part was addressing it honestly without promising more than he should. He could not give her the future she might already be imagining around the edges of her feelings. He could not meet childish devotion with romantic warmth. But he also had no intention of abandoning her to distance merely because the system moved him ahead. "You and I will still see each other," he said at last. Her eyes snapped up to his. "Even if I have missions, even if my schedule changes, we will still spend time together." It sounded simple, perhaps too simple. But children often needed simple reassurances more than elaborate explanations, and in truth, what he was saying was not false. He did intend to keep her in his life, not out of pity, not out of obligation. Because, selfishly, he wanted her there. "You promise?" she asked. The question struck deeper than she knew. Promises had once been the cruelest currency in his life. Promises to protect, promises to endure. Promises built on omissions so massive they hollowed the promises themselves from within. He had learned to fear the ease with which noble language could become the wrapping around unbearable acts. But this was not one of those promises. "Yes," he said, and because the sadness in her expression had not entirely lifted, he added what strategy and affection both suggested. "Besides, whatever I learn from my instructor, I can pass on to you. That will help you advance faster too." That did it. The cloud over her face broke almost instantly, giving way to relief and brightening hope. She smiled in a way that made him feel both warmed and vaguely guilty, as if he had once again accepted trust more freely than he deserved. Still, he let himself enjoy the sight. She moved on quickly, as children do once pain has been eased enough, launching into some story about another girl in class and a sequence of events whose details were trivial but whose emotional stakes, in her telling, were immense. Itachi listened, interjected occasionally, let the shape of the afternoon remain light. Underneath it, however, another layer of reality continued to move. That evening, while his original body sat at home and ate dinner with the family, a shadow clone wearing a transformation waited elsewhere to meet Hiruzen. Their opportunities for direct contact remained frustratingly limited. The Hokage's schedule, the risks of surveillance, and the constraints of Itachi's younger body all demanded caution. He could no longer spend chakra as though reserves were an afterthought, and even his use of clones had to be measured with exacting discipline. The clone he sent was deliberately lean in composition, enough to endure for a narrow window while minimizing cost. Under a henge, in public, with Hiruzen using one of his own transformed clones to avoid notice, they carved out the private space necessity demanded. There was something deeply absurd about a child and the Hokage meeting in disguise over dinner to discuss the hidden architecture of the future. The absurdity changed nothing. That night, the topic was his graduation. Hiruzen did not waste words. "The situation is no longer identical to your first life." Itachi understood that well enough. What he did not yet see was what specific consequence the old man had already drawn from it. Then, Hiruzen mentioned Orochimaru. The name entered the conversation like a knife slipped onto the table between them. Because Orochimaru had fled earlier this time, the shape of his former Genin team had changed. One student gone with him, one slot left open. A reconfiguration where, in the original timeline, no such opening would have existed. The Hokage had already chosen a replacement instructor. What remained was selecting another team member to fill the altered structure. "I want that member to be you," Hiruzen said. Itachi did not answer immediately. He had known from the beginning that his path through the system would not mirror the old one exactly. Too much had shifted already. Too many variables had been disturbed. Still, hearing the divergence take on concrete form made it feel newly real. Graduation was no longer just another checkpoint passed early. It was the threshold of an entirely different set of relationships, missions, and consequences. Hiruzen watched him carefully. "You see the risks?" "Yes." "And the opportunities?" "Yes." The old man inclined his head. "Then say it plainly." Itachi set down his cup. "If I join a team shaped by Orochimaru's absence, I gain influence over a line of the future that previously escaped correction. But I also lose the predictability of events tied to my original assignments, and any person formerly connected to Orochimaru carries the possibility of unseen damage." "Good," Hiruzen said. "Then we are discussing the same problem." That was how the Hokage taught him now, not through lectures, but through strategic confirmation. Name the danger, name the leverage, name what cannot be known, then move anyway. They spoke for as long as the clone could sustain itself. About the altered team. About the risks left by Orochimaru's earlier flight. About the possibility that one of his former students had not disappeared voluntarily. About how much Itachi should reveal to future teammates, which at the moment amounted to almost nothing. About the need to remain exceptional enough to shape outcomes, but not so openly disruptive that every eye turned toward him too soon. By the time the meeting ended, Itachi had the strange sensation of standing at the edge of yet another life inside the second one. The academy had been delay, peace, frustration, and restoration all at once. Graduation would end that balance. Ahead lay teams, missions, new bonds, new political leverage, and new dangers. Ahead lay the point where his rewritten childhood would stop being sheltered preparation and become active intervention. And somewhere beneath the calm with which he accepted all of this moved a quieter truth. The more paths he stepped onto, the more people he would begin to matter to. That, more than any mission, was the thing most likely to break him if he failed. Failure had always been easier to imagine in the abstract. In the abstract, it was strategic, contained. A matter of calculations gone wrong, information arriving too late, a mission compromised, an enemy underestimated, a village choosing the least terrible of several terrible options. Abstract failure belonged to reports and outcomes. It could be studied, dissected, rationalized. Concrete failure was different. Concrete failure had faces. His mother's, when she had once looked at him with full knowledge and still offered love where hatred would have been more deserved. His father's, calm even at the edge of death, carrying both disappointment and understanding in equal measure. Izumi's, preserved in memory with a softness that made what he had done to her feel somehow even crueler in retrospect. And above all, Sasuke's first, a child's trusting gaze, then a boy's shattered horror, then a young man built around a wound Itachi himself had carved. That was what made the coming change feel dangerous in a way battlefield risk never had. Graduation meant more than a new rank. It meant more people, more moving parts. More chances to shape outcomes, yes, but also more chances to damage them if he misjudged the timing, the distance, the force of his own presence in lives still taking shape. His second childhood had given him room to stabilize the foundations. His first steps as a genin would carry him out of that controlled space and into a world where variables multiplied too quickly to be held in one mind at once, which was, perhaps, exactly why part of him welcomed it. The academy had become a waiting room, a useful one, but still a waiting room. The lessons held little challenge. The routines had become familiar enough that they risked creating the illusion of safety. Itachi knew better than to trust peace that had not yet been tested. A future was not saved because policy shifted and rumors failed to spread. A future was saved only when the new structure survived pressure. Pressure was coming. The graduation exam itself was so simple that he found himself almost insulted by it. Not because the instructors were incompetent, but because the measure applied to the students was designed to sort ordinary readiness, and there had never been anything ordinary about him. Not in his first life, certainly not in this one. The written portion held no traps worth naming. The practical exercises demanded precision, basic stealth, clean chakra control, and composure under observation. The clone technique, which had humiliated Naruto in the old timeline by exposing the exact shape of his weakness before a room that had never been inclined to mercy, passed for Itachi without friction. If anything, the true challenge of the day was moderation. He could have dominated every segment with such ease that the result would have bordered on spectacle. He did not. Spectacle was useful only when one wished to force a narrative. Here, he needed something more subtle, undeniable excellence without unnecessary escalation, enough to justify placement. Not enough to trigger the kind of attention that distorted expectations beyond even what Uchiha air already guaranteed, so he performed with disciplined brilliance. Not sloppy, never that, just measured. By the end, the outcome was predictable. He graduated at the top. The announcement stirred exactly the reactions one would expect. Instructors wore the satisfied expressions of adults who enjoyed having their judgments confirmed. Some students looked impressed, others annoyed. A few carried themselves with the brittle stiffness of people who had hoped, despite all available evidence, that the prodigy might somehow stumble in public and restore balance to the world. Itachi registered all of it without attachment. What mattered was not their admiration or resentment. What mattered was that another threshold had been crossed, and with it the timeline moved one step farther from the sequence of his first life. Not all the consequences arrived at once. The first came in the form of Izumi waiting for him afterward, with that peculiar mix of pride and threatened sadness she never quite managed to conceal when her feelings turned in opposite directions at the same time. She congratulated him with genuine warmth, then almost immediately seemed to resent that the congratulations were necessary at all, because they made the separation feel more real. He thanked her. She tried to smile as though that should be enough. It wasn't, of course. He could see the worry working beneath the surface. Missions now, instructors now, teammates now, dangers now, all the machinery of shinobi life that would begin pulling him into circles she did not yet belong to. He remembered their conversation at the dango shop and knew reassurance alone would not settle her this time. The day had made the transition tangible, so he gave her something more concrete. "When my team is assigned," he said quietly, "I'll tell you. And when schedules allow, I'll still meet you after classes. That part doesn't change." Her eyes searched his face as though looking for signs of politeness, evasion, anything that might weaken the promise. Apparently she found none because the tension in her shoulders eased just enough to show. "You'd better," she muttered, trying for irritation and landing somewhere closer to relief. He allowed the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. "I know." That seemed to satisfy her more than elaborate comfort would have. Simplicity again. Children often trusted what was clear far more than what was poetic. In truth, he trusted it more too. Grand language had done enough damage in his life. Better to promise only what one intended to carry. When he returned home that evening, Sasuke was waiting as if his brother's graduation were an event of personal significance, second only to the founding of the village itself. The younger boy threw himself into the moment with such wholehearted excitement that Itachi, despite all his caution, felt something warm and almost painful spread through him. To Sasuke, this was not political advancement, not structural opportunity, not another branching point in a precarious new future. It was proof that his brother was amazing. Itachi let him celebrate. He let Sasuke ask too many questions in too little order. Let him cling. Let him demand demonstrations of techniques not suited to the indoors. Let him bask in a pride so pure it had not yet learned how fragile such things could be. Mikoto watched with open fondness. Fugaku, from his usual reserve, gave acknowledgement in the form of attention rather than exuberance, but even that restraint carried unmistakable satisfaction. The family should have felt complete in that moment, and because it did, fear returned with equal force. Not fear of immediate loss. Nothing in the room was wrong. No threat pressed at the walls. No hidden hand moved in visible reach. But contentment itself had become, for him, a warning system. Every time peace deepened, some reflex sharpened beside it, as if memory itself refused to let him inhabit happiness without also calculating how easily it could be shattered. He hated that. More than the fear itself, he hated what it did to beauty. How it placed shadows behind laughter. How it made every gentle evening feel like an object already being archived for grief. Still, he stayed present. That was part of the promise now, not only to protect the future in strategic terms, but to inhabit the life he was saving instead of merely guarding it from outside. If all he did was watch and calculate and remain half absent, then even victory would resemble another kind of failure. Sasuke did not need a flawless guardian, he needed a brother who was actually there. So, Itachi sat with him, answered him, let him chatter himself toward sleep. Later, when the house had grown quieter and the usual rhythm of evening settled into place, one of Hiruzen's summons reached him through channels subtle enough that only someone expecting them would catch the arrangement for what it was. Not urgent in the sense of immediate danger, but important enough not to delay. Itachi made his way to the meeting point using the same layered caution they had established over previous weeks. Clone, henge, low-profile route, minimal chakra expenditure. Every piece mattered. Their conversations could never afford to look like what they were. The hidden collaboration of a Hokage and a child carrying classified knowledge from a future no one else remembered. Hiruzen was already waiting when he arrived, wearing another borrowed face and the air of an ordinary man pausing for an ordinary errand. Only the eyes remained difficult to disguise. Age lived in them too distinctly. So did thought. "You've graduated," the old man said. "I have. And now we move from preparation to placement. Straight to the heart of it. As always." They sat, and Hiruzen began laying out what he had already set in motion. Orochimaru's earlier departure had left damage behind that the village was still struggling to map accurately. His former Genin team no longer existed in its previous form. One member had vanished with him or around him. Another remained. A replacement instructor had been chosen. The team itself would continue, but in altered shape. That altered shape was where Itachi would enter. Hiruzen spoke the facts with the patience of someone who knew the emotional reaction mattered less than the tactical understanding. The instructor is Mitarashi Anko. For a moment the name landed strangely. Not because Itachi did not know it. He did. In the previous timeline, Anko had become one more of Orochimaru's marked survivors. Scarred, dangerous, half defined by what had been done to her and what she had failed to become under a mentor who should never have been allowed near children. But here the frame was different. Younger. Closer to the break, a promoted shinobi forced into a role earlier and under stranger conditions than before. His student, Itachi said. Yes, Hiruzen replied, and one of the reasons I made this decision. Itachi understood immediately. Anko was not merely a leftover variable from Orochimaru's departure, she was a pressure point. Someone with direct proximity to one of the darkest futures still moving beneath the surface of the village. Putting Itachi near her could offer surveillance, influence, and perhaps, if handled correctly, intervention before old damage hardened into identity. It is a risk, Itachi said. It is. She may still be compromised. She may. You are assigning me anyway. Hiruzen's gaze did not shift. Because you are one of the few people in this village equipped to recognize the shape of that compromise before it becomes fatal. It was a ruthless answer, also a fair one. This was why Itachi respected Hiruzen more, in this timeline, than he had fully managed to. In the old, the man was not soft, or reality required hardness. He hesitated over the wrong people. Sometimes, yes. Sentiment still blurred his judgment in ways that had already proven costly where Orochimaru was concerned. But when presented with an actual strategic necessity, he did not hide from it behind comforting language. You said there is another member, Itachi said. Hiruzen nodded. Yagao Uzuki. That drew a smaller, stranger ripple through Itachi's mind. Yagao he knew only in fragments from his first life, a competent shinobi, future ANBU, someone whose path connected more visibly to others than to him. In this context, her presence altered the team's emotional balance at once. Not a random academy child, not an unknown quantity, someone older, sharper, already carrying the beginnings of the discipline that would mark her later years. So this team, he thought, would not be a standard Genin arrangement at all. It was shaping into something more volatile, an inherited fracture from Orochimaru's escape, held together by a young Jonin with compromised history, a girl who would one day navigate darker circles than most Genin ever saw, and himself, not a team. A controlled incident. The thought almost amused him. Almost. What do you need from me? He asked. Hiruzen folded his hands. Several things. First, I need you to observe Anko without treating her like an enemy. If there are signs Orochimaru left behind more than influence, seal work, conditioning, hidden contact, we need to know. Second, I need you to integrate naturally. You are not there as my spy in appearance, even if functionally that is part of the truth. Third, I need you to be a stabilizing force rather than a dominating one. That last instruction could have sounded insulting from anyone else. From Hiruzen, it was merely accurate. You are capable, the old man continued, of bending the behavior of those around you through sheer skill. Do not. Not unless the situation truly demands it. A team built around your gravity alone would become weak in ways not immediately visible. Itachi considered that. Again, the Hokage was right. Capability distorted ecosystems when allowed to act without restraint. If he solved everything, anticipated everything, outperformed everyone, then what he would build around himself would not be a functional team, but dependency wearing the mask of admiration. And dependency had its own cruelty. It deprived people of the growth they would need when he was not there. I understand. Hiruzen watched him for a beat longer, as if testing whether the understanding had truly landed. Apparently satisfied, he moved on. There is another issue, he said. Your age. That, too, was inevitable. In the original sequence of events, Itachi had graduated young. Here, because of altered enrollment, shifting academy timing, and the acceleration created by the Nine Tails aftermath, he was even younger. Capable enough to justify it, yes, but still undeniably a child in the eyes of everyone forced to assess how to deploy him. You are going to attract attention, Hiruzen said, some of it admiring, some hostile, some merely curious. Let them underestimate the cost of that attention, but do not become careless with it either. A lesson about visibility, a warning about narrative. He had lived too much of his first life under the burden of what others projected onto him not to understand that immediately. Prodigy, heir, genius, weapon, hope, threat. The names changed, the function rarely did. I won't forget, he said. Hiruzen leaned back slightly, and for a brief moment the air between them changed. Less instruction, more reflection. When you first came to me, the Hokage said, you spoke as though your role this time would be to endure whatever was necessary in silence until the future was corrected. I told you then that you would not decide alone what burdens must be carried. Itachi's posture did not move, but his attention sharpened. That was not a courtesy, Hiruzen went on. It remains true now. If this team becomes a danger to your mind or your judgment, I expect you to tell me, not after the damage is done. Before. Few things in life had made Itachi more uneasy than being asked, sincerely, to report strain before collapse. Collapse he understood, quietly carrying too much until something gave was almost a native language. But warning someone in advance, admitting limit before failure made the limit undeniable, that demanded a kind of trust he had almost never been trained to practice. And yet this, too, was part of the rewrite. The first life had taught him isolation so thoroughly that even care could feel invasive. The second, if it was to remain different, would require learning forms of reliance he had once mistaken for weakness. He dipped his head once. As you wish, Hokage-sama. When the meeting ended and the clone dissolved later, returning memory in that disorienting flash of layered awareness, Itachi sat in the quiet of his room and let the implications settle. Academy life was over. Ahead waited Team Anko, if he thought of it by leadership alone, or Team 8 in some altered precursor form, depending on how the village would eventually name and structure it. Ahead waited missions, proximity, assessment, the long work of earning trust while withholding truths too dangerous to share. Ahead waited the first truly active phase of intervention in a timeline no longer following any obedient script, and threaded through all of it was Orochimaru's old shadow. That was fitting, perhaps. For all the progress already made, the Uchiha preserved inside the village instead of banished to its edge, Naruto protected from immediate public hatred, Hiruzen awakened earlier to the political mechanics of alienation. The world had not become clean. It had merely become more winnable. The poison remained. It would just have to be confronted sooner, more intelligently, and in places where it had once gone unanswered. He lay awake longer than usual that night. Not from fear, not exactly, from awareness. The alert stillness before change became motion. In another room, Sasuke slept untroubled. Elsewhere in the village, Anko likely had no idea the Hokage was rearranging her future around a child she might not yet know how to read. Yugao surely had her own expectations, her own calculations. Orochimaru was out there already, earlier than before, moving through the dark with plans no doubt shifting in response to a village that had slipped his grasp in at least one small regard. And behind all of that, farther out, the larger architecture of danger still stood. Obito, Akatsuki, Madara's false return, all the converging roads he had not yet reached. Itachi closed his eyes. Part of him wanted to move immediately, to accelerate, to begin solving before the next sunrise had fully broken. Another part understood that what came next could not be rushed without being broken. Teams had their own chemistry. Trust had its own pace. Even strategy, when applied to human beings rather than battle maps, had to respect the time required for roots to take hold. That was a lesson the village itself had already begun teaching him. The future was not rewritten by one decisive strike alone. It was rewritten by systems, by patience, by the shaping of conditions in which different choices became possible. Tomorrow, he thought, he would begin testing whether that was true at the level of a team as well, and if it was not, no, he cut the thought off there. This life would not be governed by endings rehearsed in advance. That had been the old logic. Plan for catastrophe, accept catastrophe, become catastrophe if necessary to manage something worse. He knew now where that road led. He would not walk it so easily again. Tomorrow, he would meet the next piece of the world he meant to save. And this time, he intended to start not as a blade, but as a bond. A bond was harder to forge than a blade. A blade only needed sharpness, discipline, and a target. A bond required uncertainty. It required time, observation, patience with weaknesses that could not simply be cut away. It required room for other people to remain fully themselves instead of becoming instruments shaped around one person's purpose. In many ways, it was the more dangerous path. Blades obeyed. Bonds changed you in return. When Itachi arrived for team assignment, that truth was waiting for him in 3 different forms. Anko Mitarashi looked younger than memory had prepared him for. Not young in the way children were young, but young in the more unsettling way of adults who had been forced into certain shapes too early and not yet learned how to hide the seams. She carried herself with the restlessness of someone who distrusted stillness on principle. Sharp eyes, sharper posture, a smile that looked less like friendliness than challenge whenever it appeared at all. Her presence filled space unpredictably, as if she wanted everyone around her to remain slightly off balance. Itachi studied her the way one studied a seal array whose purpose was not yet fully known. He could see traces of Orochimaru on her without any visible curse mark needing to announce itself. Not in the supernatural sense first, but in temperament, in the brittle edge between bravado and violence, in the way alertness had become part of her body language rather than merely a mental state. In the casual hostility she seemed ready to weaponize if anyone tried to peer too closely. Trauma left signatures long before it left explanations. Beside her stood Yagao Uzuki. If Anko felt like a knife thrown into a room just to see who flinched, Yagao felt like a drawn line, measured, controlled. Already practicing some early version of the precision that would one day make her dangerous in darker circles than this. She was older than most fresh genin and seemed acutely aware of it, carrying herself with the contained discipline of someone unwilling to be dismissed as immature just because the system placed her at this rank. Her eyes flicked to Itachi once, cool and analytical, then away, filing him somewhere between fact and problem. Anko let the silence stretch just long enough to become unpleasant before she spoke. "So," she said, looking at them both with open skepticism, "this is what I get." Yigao did not react visibly. Itachi kept his face neutral. Anko clicked her tongue. "One overachieving little creep, and one girl who looks like she's already planning my funeral." "Only if you give me a reason," Yigao said. That, at least, earned the faintest sign of approval. Itachi said nothing. Anko's eyes landed on him next. And you, the famous one. Her grin turned crooked. Top of the class, child prodigy, Uchiha hair, all that fun nonsense. Are you actually as annoying as everyone says? He met her gaze evenly. I don't know what everyone says. A beat passed. Then Anko barked a laugh. Well, that's a terrible answer. Good. Means you're not completely useless. This, Itachi realized almost at once, was how she intended to manage the team. Destabilize first, establish rhythm later. It was not entirely foolish. People showed themselves faster when composure was challenged before roles had fully settled. The problem was that she was applying the method universally rather than selectively, as if daring the world to prove it deserved softer treatment. Orochimaru's shadow again. He had taught through pressure and fascination, through fear disguised as attention, through the constant implication that affection was conditional upon usefulness. Even a student who hated him afterward might still unconsciously reproduce the structure of his methods. Hiruzen had been right. Anko would need observation, not condemnation. Their first walk together was less an orientation than a moving interrogation. Anko set a fast pace through the village and expected them to keep up while throwing questions over her shoulder like Senbon. Why did they want to be shinobi? What did they think a team was for? Who would they sacrifice if forced to choose between mission success and someone they loved? Yigao answered with caution, revealing enough to avoid seeming evasive, but not enough to hand over anything private. Itachi recognized the strategy immediately and approved of it. Anko was looking not just for content, but for instinct. Who filled silence? Who resisted framing? Who panicked under morally loaded questions? When it was his turn, he chose economy. To protect what matters, he said when she asked why he wanted to be a shinobi. Anko snorted. Boring. It's still true. She looked back at him longer than necessary, perhaps measuring whether the answer had come from rote virtue or something heavier. If she suspected the latter, she let it pass. At the training ground, she finally turned fully toward them. Here's how this works. I don't care what your academy instructors told you. Teamwork is not friendship, and friendship is not trust, and trust is not automatic because someone puts a forehead protector on you and calls you comrades. You earn it. You test it. You figure out whether the idiots next to you are useful under pressure. She smiled again, all teeth and challenge. And if they're not, you make them useful. A harsh philosophy. Not entirely wrong. Itachi could almost hear how the worldview had formed. Shinobi first, sentiment second, survival purchased through utility. It was the kind of logic villages admired in theory and regretted only when it produced people too damaged to function outside combat. Today, Anko continued, I want to see what I actually have, not your academy scores, not your reputations. You, sparring, movement, response time, teamwork drills, and if either of you embarrasses me, I'll make sure the next phase hurts. Yigao looked ready. Itachi felt the old split inside himself. The part that could end every evaluation quickly through superior skill, and the part that knew doing so would poison the team before it ever truly formed. Hiruzen's warning returned with perfect clarity. Stabilize. Do not dominate. So he restrained himself. The first spar was against Yogao. She was efficient, better than most new genin had any right to be. And even in these early stages there was something elegant in the way she moved. As if she valued economy not only for practicality, but almost as an aesthetic principle. No wasted gestures. No theatrical aggression, just clean decision-making. She opened by testing range, then tempo, then angle, probing for patterns rather than charging at reputation. Good, he thought. She doesn't fight to prove herself first. She fights to understand. That made her immediately more dangerous than students who mistook intensity for effectiveness. It also meant he had to be careful. Someone observant enough to study patterns would notice very quickly if he moved like a child whose body and experience did not match. So he let her find excellence. But age-appropriate excellence. Timing a fraction less perfect than his real instinct. Counters blunted just enough to remain plausible. No techniques that implied access to years she should not imagine. He won without humiliating her, which was a delicate line and not one he trusted himself to walk perfectly, but Yigao accepted the result with little outward frustration. Anko, from the sideline, made a vague gesture of approval. Not bad, she said. You actually made him work for it. Yigao's eyes narrowed very slightly, as though noting that made him work was not the same as nearly had him. Still, she said nothing. Then Anko stepped in herself. Against her, holding back became significantly more difficult. She was fast. Not Jonin at full capacity fast, perhaps, because she was evaluating rather than trying to destroy him, but fast enough that his body had to strain to keep up even while his mind remained several beats ahead. Worse, her style was messy in a deliberate way, not unskilled but aggressively unpredictable, full of half-baits, subtle reversals, and movements designed to punish anyone who assumed clean structure. Orochimaru again, not directly. In influence. A student shaped by instability often learned to weaponize instability in turn. Itachi lasted longer than a new genin should have. He knew it, so did she. At one point her expression sharpened, not with suspicion exactly, but with the first real spark of interest. Then she increased pressure just enough to force him into a moment where body and mind separated visibly. He saw the opening, knew the correct response, could not make the child's frame obey quickly enough. Her strike stopped a hair from where his guard should have been. There, Anko said softly. He looked up. That face you made. That was the face of someone who knew better than his body could manage. Interesting. Most adults would have phrased it as praise or correction. Anko phrased it as discovery. It happens with the Sharingan, Itachi said, giving her a truth that concealed a deeper truth behind it. She considered that, then nodded once. Yeah, fair. The spar ended there. Not because she had seen enough of his limits, but because she had seen enough of his response to them. This, Itachi suspected, was how her mind worked, not cataloging strength as static quantities, but reading the friction points where skill, instinct, and temperament collided. That made her more valuable than she looked. It also made her harder to fool long term. The teamwork exercises began badly, not disastrously, just predictably. Yagao preferred precision and advanced understanding. Anko preferred pressure and adaptation. Itachi preferred efficiency so refined that, left unchecked, it erased the need for other people to act at all. These were not naturally compatible instincts on day one. Anko paired them in movement drills first-timed route changes, overlapping fields of vision, silent signal response. Yagao was fast to understand patterns once shown. Itachi was faster still, but had to deliberately leave room for her to occupy decisions rather than filling every gap before it reached her. That restraint felt unnatural in the way all worthwhile discipline did. He was not weakening himself. He was reconfiguring purpose. The objective was no longer solve fastest. It was make the unit more functional with my presence than without it. A subtler skill, possibly the rarer one. The first time he stepped back half a pace to let Yagao commit to a route choice before adjusting around her, she noticed. Not consciously, perhaps. But something in her posture shifted from guarded parallelism to the earliest form of coordination. She had expected either competition or condescension from someone with his reputation. Instead, she found space. Good, he thought. If Yagao could trust that he would not overwrite her competence, she would become easier to build with. Anko noticed too, though her expression made it impossible to tell what conclusion she drew. By midday, sweat, dust, and irritation had stripped some of the performative distance from all three of them. That was likely Anko's intention from the start. People lie more elegantly when comfortable. Exhaustion produced truer reactions. During a break, she dropped onto the grass with all the graceless confidence of someone unconcerned with appearances and tore open a ration pack like it had personally offended her. Yagao sat more neatly a short distance away, still composed even while tired. Itachi remained standing until Anko looked up and said, mouth half full, sit down, creep. You're making the air judgmental. He sat. For a few moments, the quiet held. Then Anko spoke without looking at either of them. So, here's the important part. You two Academy dolls probably didn't get taught properly. Missions don't care who deserves to come home. The world doesn't grade for effort. You can do everything right and still lose people. You can be stronger, smarter, faster, and still end up staring at blood, wondering what you missed. Yagao's gaze flicked toward her. Itachi's did not move at all. There it was, beneath the abrasiveness, beneath the chaotic humor and sharp-edged theatrics. Not just damage, but worldview hardened around damage. Anko was not talking theory. She was speaking from contact with a truth she had already met too young. So don't build your confidence on fantasy, she continued. Build it on repetition, on observation, on knowing what the people next to you do when things stop being fair. No one answered immediately, because there was nothing frivolous to say. In another life, Itachi might have dismissed her as unstable, dangerous, too shaped by Orochimaru to be trusted near younger shinobi. In this one, sitting in the uneven sunlight of a training ground while she translated pain into instruction as best she could, he saw something else. She was trying badly at times, yes. Trying through language harsher than necessary, through methods that still carried too much venom in their bones, but trying nonetheless to turn what had been done to her into something her students might survive better. That mattered. Later, as drills resumed, the team's shape began to emerge. Not harmony, not yet, but shape. Yagao was the clean line, reliable angles, quiet focus. The kind of shinobi who, if given skill and time, could become the center of a formation without ever demanding to be noticed as such. Anko was disruption, pressure, instinct sharpened into unpredictability. She would never build a team that moved prettily, but she might build one that remained dangerous after order had broken. And Itachi was still deciding what he would allow himself to become within this structure. The easiest role would be spearpoint. The one who sees fastest, moves smartest, solves first. Every team accepts such a figure eventually because competence is persuasive and danger has a way of simplifying social arrangements. But spearpoints create shadows. Everyone around them grows used to reaction instead of initiative. No, Hiruzen had been right to warn him. If this team was to matter, he would have to become something closer to a hinge than a spear. The point where talents met and strengthened each other, not merely the place from which all effectiveness radiated. It was harder than fighting, harder, perhaps, than winning. By the end of the day, Anko dismissed them with a wave that looked careless but came only after a final, assessing pause. "Tomorrow will be worse," she said. "Be ready." Yigao nodded and left without wasted motion. Itachi started to follow, but Anko's voice stopped him. "Not you." He turned. For a moment she said nothing, just watched him with an expression gone flatter than usual. Less theatrical, more precise. "You hold back in a very specific way," she said. He gave no answer. "I don't mean because you're cautious. I mean because you're choosing where everyone else gets to breathe." Her head tilted slightly. Why? The question was too sharp to dismiss and too dangerous to answer honestly. "Because teams need room," he said after a beat. Anko's brows lifted. She had likely expected denial, not principle. That sounds suspiciously wise for somebody your size. "It's still true." She stared at him a second longer, then huffed something that may have been a laugh. "Yeah," she said, "it probably is." He left then, but her question stayed with him on the walk home. Because she had seen it. Not the whole truth, not even close, but enough to touch the edge of the strategy. He was deciding where others got to breathe. Not out of arrogance exactly, though arrogance lurked in any belief that one could manage the growth of others intelligently. He was doing it because he had already seen what happened when systems taught children to become useful too quickly around someone more capable than themselves. They vanished into the gravity of that person's necessity. He would not let that happen here. At home, Sasuke met him at the door with the impatient expectation of someone who believed older brothers existed primarily to report on their day and then continue being available. Itachi found, to his own quiet surprise, that the team's rough new rhythm had not exhausted him in the way he expected. It had strained him, yes, demanded restraint, demanded constant calibration. But beneath the effort sat something almost unfamiliar. Satisfaction. Not because the team was good already. It wasn't. Not because danger had lessened. It hadn't. But because for the first time since returning, he had spent a full day not merely averting tragedy or preparing for it. He had spent it constructing, building patterns, testing trust, laying foundations in people rather than only around them. It was small, fragile, easily ruined. And still, when Sasuke tugged at his sleeve and demanded to know whether being a genin was as impressive as it sounded, Itachi could answer with something close to honesty. "It's difficult," he said. Sasuke looked delighted by that. Then Itachi added, more quietly and more for himself than for the child listening, "But I think it might be worth it." Worth it was a dangerous word. It implied possibility. It implied that effort and pain might lead somewhere other than endurance for endurance's sake. It implied that the shape of his second life was becoming something more than a long defensive maneuver against the worst memories of the first. And once a person began to believe that what they were building might truly be worth preserving, every new attachment became both motivation and weakness. Itachi understood that better than most. The second week with Team Anko sharpened that understanding quickly. Anko had not been exaggerating when she said things would get worse. If anything, she had understated it. The next phase of training was built less around individual skill and more around forced interdependence tracking exercises in difficult terrain, ambush response drills, split-second communication tests where assumptions were punished and hesitation was worse. She did not lecture much before these exercises. She preferred to let failure explain itself through bruises, missed openings, and the peculiar humiliation of being caught by a trap one should have seen coming. "Again," she would say whenever they got something wrong. Or, more often, "That was embarrassing. Try not to insult me like that twice." Yigao adapted fast. That was the first pattern to harden into reliability. Once she understood a system, she internalized it with frightening efficiency. Her instincts favored structure, but unlike many disciplined people, she did not collapse when structure broke. Instead, she rebuilt a new working model almost immediately. It was one thing to be precise when given a clean framework. It was another to invent a new one in motion. Yigao could do both. Anko respected that, though rarely in any conventional form. Your problem, she told Yagao after one particularly clean sequence through a moving obstacle drill, is that you still look offended when chaos happens. Yagao wiped dirt from her sleeve and replied, "That's because chaos is inefficient." Enko grinned, "And yet it keeps happening, almost like the world doesn't care what you prefer." Itachi, listening from nearby, saw Yagao's mouth tighten by a fraction. Not anger exactly, recognition. That was the thing about Anko's teaching. It was abrasive, but not hollow. Beneath the mockery, she kept landing on truths difficult to ignore. As for Itachi, his challenge remained one of proportion. He had to be useful enough that the team's progress accelerated naturally around him, but not so overwhelming that he became its silent center of gravity. That required daily choices, tiny ones. When to act first, when to wait, when to let Yagao notice the pattern on her own, when to follow Anko's bait instead of preempting it, when to use the Sharingan in ways that looked impressive but still plausible for his age, when to deliberately allow difficulty to remain difficulty rather than solving it too cleanly and depriving everyone else of the struggle needed to learn. He had not expected restraint to become one of the defining disciplines of his second life. The old world had trained him in escalation. If there was a burden, carry it. If there was danger, neutralize it. If there was a gap in competence, fill it. The new world, if it was to remain new, was teaching him something almost opposite. Not every gap was his to fill. Not every solution should come from him first. Sometimes leadership meant preventing one's own capabilities from becoming a kind of theft. That lesson became clearest during a mock retrieval exercise 3 days into the week. Anko split them with almost theatrical cruelty. She sent Yagao ahead on a false lead, pushed Itachi through a route full of sensory misdirection, then waited until each had been made sufficiently irritated and uncertain before triggering the real objective: recover a marked scroll and regroup under time pressure while she stalked them through the forest like a predator, growing steadily more amused. Itachi found the scroll first. Of course he did. Between his sensory discipline, pattern recognition, and sheer accumulated combat experience, the concealment measure she used was clever, but not enough. He could have retrieved it, avoided her pursuit vector, and reached the extraction point with time to spare before Yagao even understood which clue had been false. Instead, he stopped, not physically, never so obviously, but tactically. He slowed the final sequence just enough to leave room. He broke the concealment, took the scroll, then diverted in a direction that would increase the chance of intersecting Yagao's path rather than simply maximizing his own success. When he found her, she had already realized the lead was false and was recalibrating fast, irritation cutting her movements into even sharper lines. "You found it," she said. "Yes. And you came back this way." It was not a question. She was too observant for that. "There was enough time," he said. Her gaze flicked to the scroll, then to the trees around them. She understood what he had done. More importantly, she understood why. That changed the next few seconds. She did not argue, did not bristle at being included instead of bypassed. She simply adjusted pace beside him and said, "Then don't waste it." That was the first moment they felt like actual teammates, instead of two competent people temporarily enduring the same assignment. They moved together after that, not perfectly, not with the effortless sync of long-forged comrades, but with the willingness to incorporate each other's judgment in real time. Yagao read terrain and likely ambush patterns with ruthless clarity. Itachi tracked Anko's pressure tactics and adjusted their route before her attacks could fully close. When Anko finally hit them from above, expecting the sort of reaction lag that usually followed newly improvised teamwork, she instead found Yagao already shifting to the flank Itachi had left open on purpose. The result did not defeat her. That had never been realistic. But it surprised her. And on Anko's face, surprise always looked like the opening moment of delight before she remembered to be dangerous again. They escaped with the scroll intact and time barely remaining. At the extraction point, Anko dropped from a branch with the easy violence of a snake falling where it had already decided to bite, then held out a hand for the scroll. Itachi gave it to her. She waited once, though she clearly did not need to, and said, "You almost looked like a real team for a second there." Yagao crossed her arms. "Almost? Oh, don't be greedy. Earn your praise properly." Then Anko's eyes moved to Itachi. "You," she said, "did something smarter than just winning." He kept his expression neutral. That made her grin wider. "See? That face right there. That's exactly why I'm suspicious of you." The suspicion did not alarm him as much as it should have. In some strange way, suspicion from Anko felt less dangerous than admiration would have. Admiration invited projection. Suspicion invited attention, and attention, if one managed it correctly, could be directed. By the end of the week, the team's internal shape had become clear enough that even casual observers might have named it. Yagao was the blade of order. Anko was the force that broke order and taught survival anyway. And Itachi had become Despite his intention to resist easy centrality, the quiet point where both modes translated into each other. He did not dominate, he did not command, but he understood each of them in ways that made it easier for them to work through him than around him. When Enko created the chaotic problem, Itachi could often identify the principle hidden beneath it and reflect it back in terms Yugao would act on. When Yigao defaulted toward over-control, Itachi could adjust the team's response just enough that Anko's unpredictability became an asset rather than a disruption. That role unsettled him, not because it was unpleasant, but because it fit too well. He had always been good at existing between worlds. Clan and village, duty and affection, violence and tenderness, truth and concealment. Perhaps it was inevitable that he would also become good at existing between these two shinobi, one all sharpened instinct and jagged adaptation, the other all discipline and measured execution. Still, he remained wary of the cost. There were signs in Anko that troubled him more. The better he understood her. Sometimes, after a difficult drill, she would go momentarily too still, not restful stillness, watchful stillness, the kind that suggested memory had crossed the boundary into the present before she shoved it back again. Other times, when she corrected them physically, shifting a stance, redirecting a grip or touch, carried the tiniest flash of over-precision, as if the body remembered old lessons associated with danger. And once, during a discussion about stealth infiltration, she casually described a method so invasive and psychologically coercive that Yigao went silent for a full 3 seconds before Anko blinked and muttered, "Right, forget that one for now." That was the moment Itachi understood the real depth of the problem. Orochimaru had not merely harmed Anko in some abstract mentor-student sense. He had shaped her practical understanding of what training was allowed to be, what methods counted as legitimate, how much fear could be used before it became damage rather than conditioning. She was not reproducing him fully. There was too much rebellion in her for that. But she had inherited enough of his framework that intervention would need to happen carefully, repeatedly, and without making her feel cornered. A shinobi who felt cornered became defensive. A shinobi with Anko's history might become self-destructive. So, Itachi watched, adjusted, redirected where possible. He did it quietly, a small comment after a drill that reframed success in terms of trust rather than pressure. A suggestion to Yugao phrased in a way that led her to ask questions Anko would answer differently than if challenged outright. A deliberate response under stress that showed Anko another teaching option without ever labeling it as correction. It was delicate work. It also felt strangely human. Not strategy on the scale of villages, not the interception of apocalyptic threats. Just one damaged person trying to train 2 younger ones without passing on the full shape of what had broken her. And one of those younger ones, though not truly younger in mind, trying to help her do it better without exposing the impossible knowledge that told him why it mattered. This, Itachi thought more than once, was what changing the future actually looked like at ground level. Not heroics, not declarations. 100 quiet interventions no one would ever write into history. Outside Team Anko, the village continued shifting in subtler ways. The new placement of the Uchiha district near major market routes was already reshaping daily contact. Itachi saw it in passing moments. Civilians entering clan-adjacent shops without hesitation, younger Uchiha children moving through mixed spaces with less stiffness, the simple erosion of mystery that happened when people were forced into ordinary proximity often enough. Pride remained. Tension remained. But estrangement had begun losing some of its protected space. At home, Fugaku talked more often about village logistics than clan grievance, not because grievance had vanished, but because practical opportunities now existed alongside it. That mattered. Resentment grows best in environments where every conversation confirms exclusion. Once advantage enters the picture, once responsibility intersects with benefit, the emotional logic sustaining resentment becomes less pure. Mikoto seemed lighter too, not transformed, just less braced. That was enough to break his heart all over again, because it showed how much of her in the first life had been consumed by trying to hold a family and clan together beneath pressures no one had properly relieved. Even Sasuke felt the difference, though he would never have named it. Children absorb atmosphere long before they understand politics. In this life, his early world carried less tension in the walls. More laughter reached him intact. More evenings ended in warmth instead of low-voiced discussions after he had supposedly gone to sleep. This was what Itachi had wanted. This was what made the remaining danger harder to tolerate, because danger had not gone anywhere. Hiruzen's communications remained sparse but meaningful. Orochimaru was still at large. Danzo was quieter, which only made him more dangerous. And farther out, like storm fronts beyond visible mountains, lay the threats still too large and distant for direct confrontation. Obito, Akatsuki, the false Madara. the architecture of war not yet fully assembled but already moving toward assembly. Sometimes, Itachi felt as though he were standing in a house he had finally begun to repair while knowing an entire season of storms still intended to test the roof. One evening, after an especially punishing day that ended with Enko declaring them slightly less useless than before, he met Hiruzen again through the same layered precautions they had developed. The Hokage listened without interruption as Itachi summarized the team's progress, Enko's strengths, Yigao's adaptability, and his concerns regarding Orochimaru's lingering influence on Enko's methods. When he finished, Hiruzen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And how are you?" Itachi had been expecting strategic follow-up. He had not been expecting that. "I'm functional," he answered. Hiruzen's expression shifted only slightly, but enough to make clear the answer had not satisfied him. "That is not what I asked." Itachi said nothing. The old man let the silence stand, not as pressure, as invitation. It was infuriatingly effective. At length, Itachi chose precision over evasion. "The team is useful," he said. "More useful than I anticipated this early. That makes them valuable. Alston B." He paused. "And because they are becoming valuable, it becomes easier to fear failing them. They're honest enough without overexposure." Hiruzen studied him with the patient sadness of someone who knew too much about what responsibility could do to children, even gifted ones. "You cannot protect them from all pain." I know. "You also cannot build them by treating them as pre-losses." That landed harder, because it was true. A pre-loss was exactly what his mind kept trying to make of every attachment. A future grief to manage in advance, a point of vulnerability to account for before it could fully become love. It was, in some dark way, a method of emotional control. If he half-mourned people early enough, perhaps the eventual blow would land on ground already prepared. Except, it didn't work. It had never worked. All it did was poison the present. "I'm aware," he said quietly. "Being aware is not always the same as changing." No, it was not. When Itachi returned home that night, Sasuke was waiting up past when he should have been asleep, trying and failing to pretend otherwise. Mikoto scolded him gently. Sasuke objected with all the indignation available to a tired child determined to remain involved in events. Fugaku, reading nearby, glanced up over the edge of the page with the kind of look that meant he had noticed everything and judged none of it worth formal comment yet. Itachi stood there for one strange, suspended second and saw the whole room as if from far away. This was the life, not the idea of it, not the goal. The life itself. Incomplete, threatened, temporary, imperfect, yes, but present. Here, happening now. Not a pre-loss, not a strategic asset, not merely what he was trying to save, what he was already living. Sasuke reached for him, annoyed that his brother had gone so long without immediately explaining his whereabouts. Itachi crossed the room and let himself be pulled fully back into it. Being pulled back into it did not make the danger smaller, it only made the cost of failure more visible. That was the paradox he had to learn to live inside. In his first life, distance had become both defense and function. He had stepped away from people emotionally not because he felt nothing, but because feeling too much while carrying too much had seemed incompatible with survival. Detachment made choices cleaner. Crueler, yes, but cleaner. It allowed him to move through impossible decisions as though they belonged to a world of principle rather than a world of faces. This life would not let him hide that way. Every day with Team Enko made that clearer. Every evening at home made it undeniable. The more he allowed himself to participate in ordinary life instead of merely guarding it from a distance, the more he understood that real protection was not sterile. It was intimate. It bound the protector to the protected in ways that could not be reduced to mission logic. A village was not a concept. A clan was not a concept. A team was not a concept. They were people, rhythms, habits, irritations, affections, the thousand small things that made loss unbearable because they made life specific. And because life had become specific again, the first true field mission with Team Enko felt less like deployment and more like a test the world had been waiting to administer. It was not supposed to be remarkable. That, in hindsight, was almost funny. Every disaster in shinobi history seemed to begin wrapped in ordinary paperwork. Escort, retrieval, patrol, border verification, message delivery. Something small enough that no one respectable wanted to waste better personnel on it, and no one honest could fully guarantee would remain small once human unpredictability entered the equation. This one began as a reconnaissance and confirmation assignment along a route tied loosely to merchant activity and lightly to border movement. Nothing glamorous, no high-profile target, no explicit expectation of combat, just enough irregularity in local reports to justify sending a team out to observe, confirm, and return. The kind of mission meant to teach younger shinobi procedure without drowning them in risk. Enko hated that kind of description on sight. Any mission that sounds easy, she said as they gathered before departure, is either lying or stupid. Sometimes both. Don't get attached to the paperwork. Yagao adjusted her gear with methodical calm. Itachi said nothing. He agreed. The village gates fell behind them under a pale morning light that made the world look cleaner than it ever really was. They traveled fast, but not recklessly, Anko setting a pace that forced both her genin to remain attentive without burning themselves too early. She spoke little once they were beyond the village proper. Her earlier tendency to provoke and needle did not vanish in the field, but it thinned into something more focused, less performance, more vigilance. That alone told Itachi much about her. However erratic she seemed in training, mission space narrowed her into hard competence with almost frightening efficiency. The route led through mixed terrain, road, brush, broken tree cover, and a stretch of uneven ground where older conflict or weather had left the landscape subtly hostile to easy movement. A good place for smugglers, a good place for scouts, a good place for shinobi who did not want to be found unless they had already chosen where the confrontation would begin. Anko dispersed them carefully, not far enough to isolate, far enough to widen sensory coverage. Yagao took the cleaner angle, tracking for sign with the patience that turned attention into an art form. Itachi moved through a slightly less direct line, scanning not only for physical traces, but for rhythm places, where the environment felt interrupted rather than merely used. Anko ranged widest of all, a mobile point of pressure rather than a stationary center. The first hour produced little beyond minor inconsistencies. Disturbed brush, a scuff that might have been old, faint evidence of cart passage where no legitimate merchant had recently been scheduled to move. Useful enough to justify the mission, not enough yet to define its true shape. Then Itachi found the wire. It was good work. Tension low, placed in shadow, fixed to a trigger that would not kill but would announce. Primitives by shinobi standards, but smart in context. Whoever had laid it expected either civilians too careless to notice or shinobi arrogant enough to assume anything unsophisticated was irrelevant. He signaled silently. Yagao adjusted position at once. Anko appeared a few breaths later without any obvious sound preceding her. She crouched near the trap, eyes narrowing. "Thoughts?" she asked quietly. "A warning line," Yagao said. "Designed to buy reaction time, not cause damage." "Which means?" Anko prompted. "They don't trust the terrain alone to cover them," Itachi said. "Or they need to know exactly when someone enters a controlled area." Anko glanced between them, then gave the tiniest nod. "Good." So now the mission got more interesting. That was how she phrased increased danger. Interesting. They bypassed the wire without springing it and pushed forward under heightened caution. From there, the signs multiplied. Not by much, just enough. A second hidden line further on. A partially masked footprint from someone disciplined enough to reduce trace, but not erase it fully. An old campsite reoccupied recently by more than one person, too organized for drifters. Too light for a proper squad. Smugglers, perhaps. Or intermediaries. Or shinobi avoiding official channels. The mission was already no longer what the paperwork wanted it to be. By midday, they found the first body. Not fresh, not ancient either. Civilian male, travel-worn, throat cut cleanly, then concealed poorly beneath brush that would have hidden him only from anyone not actively looking. No valuables worth obvious theft remained on him, which in itself suggested the murder had not been an impulsive robbery. More likely he had seen something, or been carrying something, or simply become inconvenient in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yagao's face hardened. Anko examined the corpse with the detached precision of someone who had seen enough death to reserve visible emotion for later, if at all. No village markings, no immediate clue who he belonged to. Itachi studied the concealment. He wasn't meant to stay hidden long. Anko looked up. Meaning? Meaning discovery serves somebody, either as intimidation, misdirection, or timing. Yagao's gaze flicked over the surrounding ground again. Then we're being shaped. That earned the slightest of Anko's sharp smiles. Now you're thinking like people who might survive. They reported the body location to memory and moved on, because staying too long in a manipulated environment was exactly how one became part of someone else's plan. The attack began less than 20 minutes later. Not dramatically. No shouted warning. No theatrical reveal. Just the sudden slice of a projectile through leaves where Yugao's head had been half a second earlier, followed by the deeper, more dangerous silence of trained bodies moving where ordinary ears would hear nothing. Anko barked one command, break, and the team moved. This was the moment all training became either structure or decoration. Yugao did not freeze. She dropped, redirected, and reached cover with the kind of speed that proved she had been prepared for exactly this transition. Itachi pivoted through a route already chosen the instant the first weapon flew, using the tree line not simply to shield himself, but to widen his view of likely flanking angles. Anko vanished upward and sideways almost simultaneously, All previous carelessness burned away in favor of lethal readiness. 3 attackers, Itachi counted first, then 4, not elite, not civilians. Somewhere in the ugly middle where competence became dangerous precisely because it often escaped early underestimation. Their coordination suggested either mercenary work or low-level shinobi trained outside a formal village structure. Enough discipline to stage an ambush. Not enough refinement to hide every intention from someone reading deeper patterns. The first exchange was chaos in the ordinary sense: motion, steel, bark splintering, terrain weaponized instantly by people who had already selected where every line of sight would hurt the most. But underneath that chaos, Itachi saw the architecture. One close-pressure fighter attempting to pin movement. One ranged distraction. One holding back for the retrieval objective, whatever that truly was, and one whose role remained obscured, which made that last one the most important. He relayed the first 3 positions in clip signals. Yigo adjusted off them immediately. Anko did not need the help, but she absorbed it anyway, using the confirmation to commit harder against the pressure point on the left flank. The mistake would have been trying to end it quickly alone. He felt that urge like muscle memory. Every opening suggested acceleration. Every hesitation on the enemy side looked punishable. His Sharingan offered angles faster than his team could fully parse. A cleaner, older version of himself would already have broken the formation open and turned the fight into a sequence of isolated losses. But Hiruzen's warning, Anko's training, and his own new discipline all held. Do not turn teamwork into spectatorship, so he fought in a way that multiplied them instead. He intercepted rather than erased, redirected rather than overran. When Yigao moved to cut off the ranged attacker's fallback line, Itachi shifted pressure just enough that her route stayed viable. When Anko drove one opponent off balance through sheer ferocity, Itachi used that created instability to deny another attacker the support timing he wanted. None of it was flashy. Most of it would look, to an outsider, like very good reactive fighting. It was not reactive. It was orchestration disguised as cooperation. Then the hidden 4th role revealed itself, a second line of traps. Not laid broadly across the battlefield, but positioned to shape retreat vectors and punish exactly the kind of movement ambush targets usually defaulted toward under pressure. One tag ignited against a tree, where Yigao would have used cover if Itachi had not caught the pattern an instant sooner and signaled her across instead. The burst was small, more noise and disruption than true destruction, but it confirmed the enemy had planned for trained opposition. This was no merchant route nuisance. Anko saw it too. "Change of assessment," she snapped. "They've prepped layers." No one answered. No one needed to. The fight sharpened. One attacker closed on Yigao with overconfidence after the explosive tag failed to claim space. That was his last clean mistake. She met him with precision so sudden it almost looked cruel, stepping inside his expectation and stripping the weapon line from him before he fully understood how she had altered angle. Not enough to finish him. She was still young, still learning how far to commit, but enough to open him brutally. Itachi used the opening she created to force the man back farther than he intended, denying the others a clean regroup. Good, he thought. Very good. Across the clearing, Anko had abandoned all pretense of measured instruction. She was smiling now, which on her in combat looked profoundly unhealthy. Her movements became harder to read. The more dangerous they grew, a weaving rhythm of feints, aggression, and sudden verticality that reminded Itachi again just how much raw survival intelligence lived inside her body. Orochimaru had shaped her, yes, but not into helpless damage. Into something that could kill if allowed. The cost was visible in the edges of it, in how natural brutality came, in how little space there seemed to be between effective and excessive once she truly entered the flow of violence. That observation nearly distracted him at the wrong moment. The 4th enemy, the actual planer then, came for the scroll case at his side. Of course, not the standard mission case. The backup notes, route records, confirmation data, information, not money. This had never been about random violence or merchant intimidation alone. Someone was testing movement, intercepting reports, perhaps tracking what Konoha had begun noticing on these routes. The attacker moved better than the others, smarter too. A blade low, body economical, no wasted intimidation. He came not at Itachi's center, but at the line where defense of the case would distort movement and force a narrower choice. A good decision. Itachi met him anyway. This was the closest he came all day to breaking his own rule. The man was not stronger than him in any ultimate sense. But he was older, faster in raw adult body terms, and good enough that pretending lesser capability too heavily would create real danger. So for a few brief exchanges, Itachi let more of himself through than he had intended. enough that the Sharingan's reading, his counters, and the calm brutality of his efficiency all surged closer to what the older Itachi would have produced. The enemy noticed. Not consciously, perhaps, but something in his expression shifted from confident calculation to the first taste of unease, and that was when Anko arrived at his blind angle and ruined his options completely. She hit like a verdict. The man stumbled, recovered on instinct, then made the correct decision to flee before the formation around him collapsed fully. The others followed almost at once, not in total rout but in rapid disengagement shaped by prior planning. Smoke, terrain, split routes, enough discipline to avoid easy pursuit, not enough dominance to hold ground. Anko signaled stop before any of them could overextend. "Don't chase prepared retreats," she barked. "That's how idiots die trying to prove they're not scared." Breathing hard, Yagao lowered her stance by degrees instead of all at once. Itachi kept scanning until he was sure the nearest pressure had truly dispersed. Silence returned in pieces. Leaves settling, a branch giving way somewhere farther off, the sound of their own breathing recalibrating from combat to aftermath. Anko turned first to Yagao, checked the minor cut along her arm, then looked at Itachi. Her gaze lingered a fraction too long. "You," she said, not quite lightly, "are a very strange child." He did not answer. "Not wrong," Yagao said, still catching breath. That, absurdly, almost made Anko laugh. The field assessment that followed was sobering. The ambushers had not expected a high-level Konoha response, but they had expected enough resistance to prepare layered control measures. That meant organization, resources, information value. Whoever sat behind the group was not merely opportunistic. They were building something along the routes and did not want the village understanding it too early. The mission had changed again. Now there was a body, an organized interception attempt, probable intelligence theft motive, and evidence of hostile preparation beyond mere banditry. Standard protocol would require immediate return and report. Anko made that call without hesitation. Good, Itachi thought again. In some timelines, younger or prouder instructors would have pushed onward out of offense or ambition. But she understood the difference between pressing advantage and feeding a trap with ego. On the way back, the team moved tighter than before. Not because Anko ordered it, because combat had done what training only approximated. Yagao now adjusted to Itachi's smallest redirections with instinctive trust rather than analytical delay. Itachi, in turn, could read the tempo at which she preferred to commit and shape around it more naturally. Anko's position relative to them also changed. Not farther, not closer, but more intentionally responsive. She was no longer just evaluating how they handled field stress. She was using what she had learned. That was the real result of first combat, not confidence, calibration. They reached the village without further engagement, but the return felt different from the departure. Quieter, heavier, less like three shinobi on assignment, and more like a unit carrying the first proof that the world outside routine training remained exactly as predatory as their instructor had warned. Debrief with Hiruzen came quickly. Anko reported cleanly, her language turning sharper and more formal as mission details replaced personal style. Yagao added precise observations where asked. Itachi offered pattern analysis without overstepping rank, enough to confirm what mattered. The ambush had been planned by someone interested in controlling information flow, not simply attacking travelers. The dead civilian likely connected to that broader structure. The enemy had expected shinobi eventually. Hiruzen listened with the grave attention of a man already reorganizing internal priorities while outwardly appearing calm. When the formal portion ended and the team was dismissed, his eyes met Itachi's only briefly. Just once. But it was enough. Message received. There would be a later conversation. At home that evening, normal life tried to resume around him like water returning to shape after a stone had passed through. Sasuke wanted stories. Mikoto wanted to know whether he had eaten. Fugaku asked measured questions about mission type and conduct without prying into confidential specifics. The domestic rhythm remained steady, and for once, Itachi understood something new about its value. Home was not only what he was protecting against catastrophe. It was what taught the body that combat had ended. Without such a place, violence bled too easily into permanence. Later, when Hiruzen's arranged contact finally came, the old man's first question was not about the ambush, it was about Anko. Did she hold? An interesting choice of words. Yes, Itachi said, and more than that. She adapted correctly when the mission changed. Hiruzen nodded slightly, as though confirming an internal hope he had not yet allowed himself to state aloud. And you? There it was again, that question. I held too. The Hokage waited. Itachi exhaled slowly. I came closer than intended to, revealing too much. Because? Because one of them was good enough that pretending more weakness than was safe would have created a larger problem. Hiruzen accepted that without immediate rebuke, And did your team notice? Anko noticed that I'm not normal. The old man almost smiled. That was never truly avoidable. No, perhaps it wasn't. They moved then into analysis of the larger threat, the route, the possible intelligence network, the implication that someone was probing Konoha's awareness along outer lines. None of it yet screamed Akatsuki. None of it cleanly matched Obito's old priorities either. Which meant exactly what Itachi had feared from the beginning of successful intervention. The more they changed, the more new forms of danger began growing in spaces old ones no longer occupied quite the same way. A better future did not mean fewer enemies. Sometimes it only meant different ones. When the conversation ended and night deepened around the house, Itachi remained awake longer than usual. Not from shock, from recognition. Today had been the first real proof that Team Anko could function under genuine pressure. Not perfectly, not beyond risk, but function. And because they could function, the path ahead widened. More missions, harder ones. More exposure to the forces already rearranging themselves beyond the village. The old world had moved toward its first life through isolation, suspicion, and hidden rot left unchecked too long. This new world was moving differently, but it was moving all the same. Change was not stasis. Change was motion. Motion invited collision. He lay in the dark and thought not of the ambush itself, but of one tiny moment within it. Yigao trusting his signal without hesitation, Anko arriving exactly where pressure would break the enemy's last clean plan. The three of them moving as if for several breaths, they belonged to the same sentence. A team. A real one now, whether any of them wanted to sentimentalize it or not. That made the next truth unavoidable. If the future intended to test him through politics, through Akatsuki, through old ghosts and new enemies, then it would not be facing him alone anymore. And for the first time, that felt less like risk than strength. Strength, however, had a way of changing the nature of danger rather than reducing it. A lone shinobi could disappear into the logic of survival. Fail alone, succeed alone, choose alone. There was a brutal simplicity to that, the kind Itachi had spent much of his first life mistaking for discipline. A team complicated everything. Competence was no longer measured solely by what one could do under pressure, but by what one could preserve while doing it. Every success now created continuity. Every continuity created stakes. Every stake invited a new category of fear, not merely what an enemy might do to him, but what his presence in this altered future might expose others to, if his calculations proved even slightly wrong. He knew better than to say any of that aloud. Anko would probably call him dramatic and then assign extra conditioning out of irritation. Yigao would likely absorb the statement in silence, then quietly begin carrying the burden herself just to prevent imbalance. Hiruzen would look at him with that careful, sorrowing patience that made Itachi feel more observed than he liked. So he kept the thought where he kept so many others, beneath function, beneath composure, beneath the day-to-day work of building something stable enough to survive the truths he still could not share. The village, meanwhile, kept moving. That was the strange thing about history when lived from inside. Even after an ambush, even after evidence of hostile organization on Konoha's outer routes, even after all the secret recalculations happening in offices and hidden meetings, life refused to turn wholly dramatic just because danger had sharpened somewhere nearby. Shops still opened, children still ran through streets, clan duties still accumulated, meals still needed preparing. The academy still consumed and graduated hopefuls into a profession that would make some of them old and others dead before their time. Perhaps that was why villages endured. Not because they were strong in any singular heroic sense, but because ordinary life insisted on continuing around every crack. For Team Anko, ordinary life after the mission meant debrief, recovery, and then immediate adjustment of training priorities. Anko did not believe in letting the lessons settle romantically. On the very next field day, she drove them through scenario work built specifically around the weaknesses exposed in the ambush. Counter-trap movement under pressure, false retreat recognition, rapid terrain reassessment after enemy disappearance, communication drills when line of sight was broken. Her energy throughout was viciously focused, though less wild than before. The mission had done something to her too, Itachi realized. Not in a breaking sense, in a clarifying one. She trusted the team more now. Not sentimentally, not fully, but enough that her training sharpened from generalized pressure into targeted improvement. That was one of the odd mercies of surviving danger together. It cut away certain performative tests. Once someone had seen how you moved when steel was real, they no longer had to keep guessing through elaborate rehearsal. Again, Anko said after Yigao nearly triggered a pressure line meant to simulate panic retreat. Your problem is that you still think danger will announce itself in the style you prefer. Yigao, dusty and annoyed, replied, My problem is that your traps are irrational. They're alive, Anko shot back. That's what bothers you. Yigao looked like she wanted to argue further, then stopped and recalibrated in silence. That too was becoming one of her strengths. She did not waste energy protecting ego once she recognized a point worth incorporating. Anko then turned to Itachi. "And you," she said, "keep trying to be elegant under ugly conditions." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Would you prefer sloppiness?" "I'd prefer you stop assuming the cleanest answer is always the safest one." That landed. Not because she knew the full truth of him, but because she kept circling pieces of it with unsettling instinct. The first life had rewarded elegance in ugly conditions. It had trained him to make terrible necessities look almost inevitable, even refined, so that others could endure their existence. But ugliness did not become less ugly because one moved through it with precision. Sometimes the attempt to remain clean inside corruption only made a person more vulnerable to the corruption's logic. He said nothing. Anko smirked. "See? That face means I'm right." Wan Higao glanced between them, perhaps beginning to understand that some of Anko's sharpest criticisms of Itachi were not mere irritation, but a strange kind of tactical trust. She expected him to absorb more because she sensed, correctly, that he could. That was both useful and dangerous. Useful, because it created a training environment in which his growth did not rely entirely on concealment. Dangerous, because the more accurate Anko's instincts became, the harder it would be to maintain plausible limits around the deeper truths she could never be allowed to know. A prodigy could be strange. A gifted child could be mature beyond comfort. But there were edges to him. No ordinary explanation would fully smooth over forever, so he adapted the same way he always had, by becoming easier to read in ways that concealed how much remained unreadable. He let some annoyance show when drills became unnecessarily repetitive. Let fatigue register honestly when his younger body truly hit its threshold. Let the occasional dry response slip through instead of flattening every interaction into polite detachment. These were small things, but they mattered. People trusted visible humanity more than flawless composure. Flawless composure looked like armor. Armor encouraged either challenge or distance. Around Yigao, the shift was quieter but just as significant. Their teamwork after the ambush had moved beyond theoretical coordination into something with rhythm. Not effortless yet, but increasingly intuitive. She no longer watched him with the same suspicion she had in the beginning. The suspicion had not vanished entirely. Yigao was too careful for that, but it had transformed into active assessment rather than guarded resistance. She was learning his patterns. More importantly, she was learning that his patterns did not seek to reduce her role. That became clearest during a live tracking exercise Anko assigned a few days later. The objective was simple on paper and painful in practice. Identify a concealed route through uneven forest, follow it without being baited into decoy sign, and mark every point where an enemy could plausibly shape pursuit. The task required patience more than speed, but impatience was exactly what Anko wanted to provoke by setting time pressure that made every slow decision feel like potential failure. Yigao found the first real sign, noticed the second, paused at the third with enough uncertainty that Itachi could almost feel the old version of himself wanting to answer immediately, to save time, to push them back into certainty. Instead, he waited. One breath. Two. Just enough. Xiao Kao crouched lower, studied the broken growth at the base of a tree, then murmured, "This one's wrong on purpose." Itachi nodded once. Yes. She did not ask if he had known already. He did not volunteer that he had. That exchange, tiny and almost invisible, mattered more than a dozen flashy saves. It allowed competence to remain shared ground rather than hierarchy. Allowed discovery to belong to her without pretending he had not also seen it. Balance. Always balance. Later, when they reported the full route and Anko realized they had successfully ignored 3 decoy markers in sequence, she stared at them for a long second and said, with the deep reluctance of someone handing out a treasure more precious than gold, "Acceptable." Yigao looked pleased in spite of herself. Anko noticed, of course, and added, "Don't make that face, it ruins the moment." The team laughed. Yigao quietly, Itachi barely but genuinely, Anko like someone surprised to find laughter had joined the training ground without permission. For a moment the whole thing felt absurdly normal. That, perhaps, was why the next layer of unease returned so sharply. Because normal was exactly what made anomalies stand out. The report from the ambush mission had already triggered quiet changes in village response patterns, more patrol scrutiny, more discreet intelligence attention on transit routes, more careful handling of merchant movement data. None of this was visible to civilians, and most shinobi outside relevant chains of duty would likely never notice. But Itachi, who had learned long ago to read systems through their subtle pressure shifts, could feel the village adjusting under the skin. At the same time, another tension began to stir, one less immediate but more familiar in a way he disliked. Attention, not broad public fame exactly. That had always been inevitable for the Uchiha heir, who graduated absurdly young and performed too well, too consistently. This was different. Professional attention. The kind that came from other shinobi noticing that Anko's new team, hastily assembled from disrupted circumstances, had returned from a routine mission carrying evidence of something more serious and had handled themselves above expectation while doing it. People started looking a second too long. Not suspiciously, not yet. Curiously, measuringly. In some circles that attention settled on Anko, Orochimaru's former student, now unexpectedly fielding a promising team in the aftermath of his earlier defection. In others, it settled on Yigao, whose age and demeanor already placed her slightly outside standard genin assumptions. And in more than a few, it settled on Itachi, because prodigies made easy stories and stories made easy shortcuts for thought. He hated shortcuts. Shortcuts had shaped too much of his life already. Child genius becomes special case. Special case becomes tool. Tool becomes burden bearer. Burden bearer becomes secret. Secret becomes sacrifice. At every stage, someone had looked at unusual capability and concluded the normal protections of childhood, honesty, and mutual responsibility no longer applied. This time, he would not let that happen so easily. But knowing one would resist a pattern and successfully resisting it were not always the same thing. The village system did not need to be malicious to become dangerous, it only needed to be efficient. Efficiency always leaned toward using what worked, especially when what worked was willing to endure more than it should. Hiruzen understood that. That was why, during their next covert exchange, he raised the subject before Itachi did. "You're being noticed," the Hokage said. It was not a question. Yes. "And how do you assess the risk?" Itachi considered before answering. Hiruzen deserved precision, not reflex. "Manageable for now," he said. "Most of it is still narrative attention, not operational dependency. But if Team Anko continues outperforming expectation, that could change." Hiruzen nodded. "Then the response is not to underperform." "No." "Good. I wanted to hear you say it." That almost annoyed him, which Hiruzen likely anticipated. The old man continued, "We will not preserve this future by teaching you to make yourself smaller every time the system notices your capability. That only creates a different kind of distortion." Itachi knew he was right. Still, part of him had indeed been leaning towards some version of strategic diminishment. Better to be underestimated, better to remain difficult to categorize, better not to become indispensable. But Hiruzen was drawing a finer distinction. The danger was not visibility itself. The danger was what structures did with visible competence afterward. "So," Hiruzen said, "the task is not to hide what you can do. The task is to prevent that from becoming an excuse to place the wrong burdens on you." Easier said than done. Yet that too was part of why the alliance with the Hokage mattered. In the old timeline, there had been almost no one positioned to intervene before expectation hardened into exploitation. Here, there was at least one man trying to do so consciously, if imperfectly. They spoke then of broader developments. The route ambush did not map cleanly onto Akatsuki's old sequence, which meant caution without over-assumption. Orochimaru's movements remained difficult to pin down, though evidence suggested he was laying groundwork rather than acting impulsively. Danzo had become more careful in how openly he pressed his preferred policies, never a comforting sign. And then there was Obito, or the Masked Man, or whatever false face history eventually chose to name him under. No direct sign yet. But absence in such matters was not reassurance. It was simply absence. When the strategic talk ended, Hiruzen's eyes settled on him with that same infuriating patience. And outside of strategy? Itachi almost sighed. "The team is improving," he said. "That was not the question either." "No, it wasn't." Hiruzen waited. Itachi chose his words carefully, because carelessness here would either invite too much concern or collapse back into old evasions. They matter more now. The Hokage's expression softened by a fraction. That tends to happen. "It complicates judgment." Yes, it also improves it. That answer seemed to satisfy him more. Because it was true, attachment complicated judgment, but not always in corrupting ways. Sometimes it sharpened moral sight. Sometimes it prevented efficiency from becoming cruelty. Sometimes it forced a person to account for consequences they might otherwise dismiss in the name of necessity. The key difference was whether attachment ruled judgment or whether it humanized it. In the first life, he had been asked to think like a weapon too often and too young. In this one, perhaps, he was being taught how to think like a protector without becoming the sort of protector who swallowed everyone else's agency whole. That was a subtler education than any academy had ever offered. At home, signs of the village's broader change continued filtering inward through small domestic shifts. Fugaku and Mikoto argued less in tones that carried hidden clan anxieties. Sasuke moved through the household as if safety were an assumed property of the world rather than a temporary blessing. Even casual discussions around the district had altered. Not free of pride, not free of grievance, but no longer defined so completely by distance from the village center. The new placement near market life had done what policy papers could never fully capture. It had forced repeated ordinary contact. And repeated ordinary contact was dissolving the exaggerated mystique that isolation once fed. Itachi saw it when civilians entered Uchiha-run shops without that subtle edge of hesitation. Saw it in how younger clan members spoke of the village with slightly less inherited defensiveness. Saw it in how Mikoto, once close friends with Kushina, could discuss village matters without every sentence sounding shadowed by caution. These were not dramatic victories. No monument would ever be raised to the political power of a well-placed district. But such things mattered. A people excluded too long begin to narrate themselves through exclusion. A people reinserted into the shared blood flow of daily life are harder to mythologize as wholly separate. And yet, the better things became, the more one awful truth persisted. He was no longer only trying to stop the old catastrophe. He was building a new world whose value made any future catastrophe even more intolerable. That realization came into full focus one evening when Sasuke fell asleep against him halfway through some earnest, rambling question about whether Genin missions were more exciting than academy lessons. The child's head grew heavy against his shoulder, his breathing evened. The question never reached its own ending. Mikoto moved quietly to lift him, but Itachi shook his head once and carried him himself. The room was dim, the house quiet. Sasuke's weight warm and trusting in his arms. In the old world, he thought, this would have become memory sharpened by loss. In this one, it was simply tonight. That was the thing he had to keep learning. Not every beautiful moment was a future wound rehearsing itself. Some were allowed to remain present, to be lived before they were analyzed, to be loved before they were feared. He laid Sasuke down and drew the blanket up carefully. Then he sat there for longer than necessary in the dark, watching the rise and fall of his brother's breathing, and admitted to himself something he had only half allowed before. He was becoming happy. Not all the time. Not cleanly. Not without dread and guilt and vigilance braided through it. But undeniably, dangerously, he was becoming happier than he had ever expected to be again. And because he now knew that, he also understood the next danger clearly. An enemy does not always need to break your body to break your judgment. Sometimes all they need is to threaten the thing you finally began to hope you could keep. Hope changed the way he looked at every road leading out of the village. Before, roads had meant duty, mission routes, infiltration paths, retreat lines, borders between one obligation and the next. There were things to be used, not contemplated. Now each road seemed to divide more than land. It divided futures. The path home and the path away from home were no longer abstract opposites in a shinobi's life. One held Sasuke's sleepy questions, Mikoto's soft reprimands, Fugaku's stern and carefully hidden approval, the strange rough-edged rhythm of Team Anko hardening into something real. The other held everything still waiting in the dark to test whether that life had actually been secured or merely delayed. Itachi knew better than to confuse delay with victory. That lesson had been burned into him too deeply. Still, hope made delay feel less like treading water and more like construction. Every week that passed without the old fractures widening in familiar ways, every small success that settled into normalcy, every relationship that deepened instead of breaking under pressure, all of it accumulated into something heavier than optimism. It became investment. And investment invited risk, because people fought differently when they were no longer merely trying to survive the next disaster. They fought harder, smarter, and sometimes much less cleanly. That truth began pressing on him as Team Anko moved into a new phase. They were no longer being tested simply as genin who might someday become useful. They were becoming useful now. Missions remained limited by rank, as they should. No one in the village was foolish enough to throw a newly assembled team into major operations simply because they had performed well once. But the kind of work they were trusted with began shifting in character. Less hand-holding, less obvious instructional framing, more assignments where the village expected actual results and not merely developmental benefit. It was still low level in the grand hierarchy of shinobi labor, but the difference was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. And Itachi was always paying attention. So was Anko. Her approach changed first. She still taunted, still needled, still treated polite comfort like an infectious disease best kept at blade's length. But a layer of the earlier provocation had burned off. She no longer seemed interested in discovering whether the team could function under pressure. She had seen that they could. What occupied her now was making sure they did not become predictable in the process. "Competence is nice," she said one morning while circling them on a training field already scarred by earlier drills. It keeps people alive. But the second you start liking your own patterns too much, somebody nastier than me turns them into your funeral. That implies the existence of somebody nastier than you, Yagao said. Enko grinned with delighted offense. Rude. Also unfortunately true. Then her eyes landed on Itachi. And don't look so calm about it, creep. People like you are the easiest ones to bait, because you all think seeing the pattern means owning the pattern. That struck close enough to truth that he disliked how easily the word settled. He had spent so much of both lives relying on pattern recognition that he sometimes forgot how seductive it could become, not just as a tactical tool, but as a worldview. Observe enough, calculate enough, anticipate enough, and eventually the future began to feel less like a living thing and more like an equation. That illusion had once helped turn him into exactly the kind of weapon others found useful. It made extraordinary burdens seem solvable if only one remained disciplined enough, detached enough, willing enough. The problem was that people were not equations. Neither were teams. Neither was history. Itachi absorbed the criticism without reaction, which likely annoyed Anko and satisfied her at the same time. Yigao, however, did react, not outwardly, but in the almost imperceptible way her posture sharpened when she thought something important had just been said. That was another development inside the team. She had become increasingly skilled at reading not only terrain and enemy logic, but the hidden subtext of Anko's harsher instruction. Where once she might have heard simple provocation, she now listened for the useful structure beneath it. That made her more dangerous. It also made their team more stable. The three of them had settled into a rhythm that no longer needed to be named to function. Yagao handled clean control. Itachi translated between clean control and emerging unpredictability. Anko broke assumptions, pressured weak points, and forced adaptation before complacency could set in. Each role was now understood enough that they could shift around one another without visibly negotiating every move. That was what made the next change matter so much. They were assigned to travel farther. Not far in absolute terms, not beyond the ordinary reach of village support, but far enough that the mission brief came with different language, longer duration, less immediate fallback, greater emphasis on independent field judgment. The official objective remained narrow route verification, local contact confirmation, irregular activity assessment. But to Itachi, the true meaning was obvious. Konoha was beginning to trust the team as a field instrument, not merely a training unit. He should have been pleased. Part of him was. Another part immediately began recalculating exposure, escalation, possible intersections with broader threats, the increasing chance that useful low-level work would draw the attention of people clever enough to notice unusual effectiveness before rank officially justified it. Success did not only rise upward through praise, it moved sideways through rumor, memory, and the professional curiosity of shinobi who had survived long enough to recognize anomalies when they saw them. An anomaly was exactly what Team Anko risked becoming. He thought about that on the road out, while Yugao kept to their left flank and Anko moved ahead with the restless attention of someone who seemed most comfortable when the world still contained unanswered questions. The air carried that faint, dry edge signaling the turn of season. Not yet a dramatic shift, just the first unmistakable sense that time itself was moving the world onward whether anyone was ready or not. Time. There were moments when Itachi almost forgot the specific absurdity of his own existence because ordinary life had become dense enough to occupy him fully. Then there were moments like this, when the changing weather, the steady accumulation of missions, the altered architecture of the village, and the growth of people around him all forced the deeper recognition back into view. He had not merely gone back, he was living through time again, and time, given enough room, would create new people from the old ones. That thought came into focus most painfully when he watched Sasuke lately. Sasuke was still small enough to cling and demand and sulk with the total conviction that each feeling deserved the full moral weight of the universe. But he was also changing. His words carried a little more shape. His questions were slightly sharper. His pride, once merely adorable, had begun growing tiny edges that would one day harden into something far more serious if fed the wrong things. Every week seemed to add another thread of personhood, another visible step away from the baby Itachi had first held upon returning. It was what he wanted. It also terrified him. Because growth meant movement, and movement meant the future could no longer be protected by preserving stillness. Sasuke could not remain untouched innocence forever. He had to become. The real question was not whether he would change, but what world would be present to shape that change when it came. The same was true of Yigao, of Enko, of everyone. That understanding colored the mission more than Itachi first realized. The farther they traveled, the more the world reminded him that Konoha was not the whole map of consequence. Small settlements carried their own uneasy balances. Merchants told edited truths shaped by fear, profit, or both. Local guards saw danger differently than village shinobi did because they lacked the luxury of assuming reinforcements would arrive in time. Every roadside inn, every crossroads, every shift in accent or rumor contributed to a broader continental texture. His first life had taught him to treat mainly as operational context. This time he paid more attention, not because the terrain itself had changed dramatically, but because he had. The old Itachi would have absorbed these details efficiently and stored them by relevance to mission. The new one, or perhaps simply the older, sadder one finally being forced into fuller humanity, could not help noticing what all this fragile, ordinary life looked like when not immediately filtered through utility. Farmers worrying over weather patterns. Shopkeepers overextending hospitality because strangers might also be future customers. Children gawking at shinobi with that mixture of awe and suspicion common to people raised close enough to danger to admire protectors but not trust their profession entirely. This was what the wars touched. What Akatsuki would one day destabilize. What villages claimed to protect while often using it as justification for cruelties carried out in secret. To know that and still want to save people was one thing. To know that and begin seeing them clearly as individuals rather than faceless populations was another. The mission itself unfolded quietly at first. Too quietly for Anko's taste, which meant exactly quietly enough to make her dangerous. "They know someone's been checking routes," she murmured once, after finding sign not of overt tampering but of sign that had been cleaned too carefully. "Not because they're good, because they're nervous." Yigao crouched to inspect the disturbed ground. "Could still be smugglers." "Could," Anko said. "Could also be people with better funding pretending to be smugglers because village shinobi hear that word and lower the threat by half." Itachi looked up from the tree line. "Either way, they expect observation now." Anko's expression sharpened with approval. "Exactly. Which means we stop thinking in terms of what they're moving and start thinking in terms of what they're protecting." That shift in framing altered everything. The route markers they had been tracking ceased to look like random concealment and began to resemble a perimeter logic. Not a military perimeter exactly, too loose and deniable for that. But a controlled network of warnings, decoys, and fallback positions meant less to transport goods than to preserve a certain kind of access. Access to what remained unclear, information, perhaps. Contacts. A small node in something larger. The deeper they pressed, the more Itachi felt the old tension between useful inference and dangerous assumption. This was not Akatsuki's known pattern from his first life, but neither could he trust the comfort of saying therefore it was unrelated. Successful intervention had already begun displacing old sequences. Holes left by one altered chain of events might be filled by entirely different actors, or by the same actors working through changed methods. The map was no longer stable enough to treat deviation as reassurance. That thought followed him into the encounter they finally had near dusk on the second day. Not a direct attack this time. A contact. A man who claimed to be a local intermediary, all open gestures and practical concerns, eager to explain away route irregularities as the harmless overprotectiveness of merchants worried about theft. On paper, he played the role well. Too well. Enough humility to seem non-threatening. Enough irritation at logistics to seem authentic. Enough local detail to pass a casual check. Yigao was not fooled. Anko was not interested in being fooled. And Itachi, from the first moment, recognized the deeper mismatch. The man was controlling his breathing too consciously. Not in the obvious way of someone lying badly. In the more practiced way of someone who had learned to calibrate affect under scrutiny. Civilian merchants did not usually regulate themselves that tightly in the presence of shinobi. Smugglers might. Low-level operatives certainly would. Anko let him talk. That was one of the things Itachi was learning to admire about her. She did not always rush at falsehood just because she recognized it. Sometimes she let deception build out its own scaffolding first, because people and lies often revealed more through what they chose to explain than what they avoided. When the man finished, she tilted her head and said, conversationally, "Interesting." He smiled too quickly. "Is something wrong?" "Oh, probably lots of things," Anko said. "I just haven't decided which one belongs to you yet." The man's expression held for another breath, then fractionally changed, not into fear, but into contingency. That was enough. What followed was not a battle in the dramatic sense, but a collapse. His story failed. He moved. Yigao cut off the angle he wanted. Itachi denied the second, and Anko arrived exactly where his remaining options should have become escape. He did not die. He surrendered too intelligently for that, calculating correctly that whatever organization sat behind him preferred silence, but not necessarily immediate martyrdom. Interrogation would belong to others. Still, even brief contact revealed what mattered. The man carried coded route notations inconsistent with normal merchant protection. No village insignia, no clean ties to major powers. But enough training and enough support to prove this was not petty criminal improvisation. On the way back with the captive secured, Anko's mood darkened in a way that had little to do with simple mission seriousness. "You see it, right?" she said low enough that only her team could hear. "Yes," Yagao answered first. Itachi nodded. Anko spat to the side in disgust. "People always think the rot starts at the top. Big leaders, big conspiracies, big traitors. But half the time, it starts like this. Little hidden routes, small networks. Useful nobodies getting paid to make sure information goes where it shouldn't and never goes where it should." Itachi heard more than field pragmatism in that. He heard someone who knew too intimately how secret systems grew beneath official ones, until the distinction between village protection and private agenda began collapsing. Orochimaru again. Danzo too, though Anko would not have her full pattern for that yet. "This won't stay small," Yagao said. Anko glanced at her, then gave a humorless smile. "That's because nothing profitable ever does." Konoha received the prisoner. The reports widened. Quiet investigations multiplied, and somewhere beyond the immediate paperwork, Itachi could feel new lines beginning to connect between this hidden route network and broader village concern. Not yet enough for certainty, more than enough for unease. Then, almost as if the world had decided one shift was not enough, time moved again, not through some dramatic declaration, through accumulation. Mission followed mission, training deepened, seasons turned, Sasuke grew, the village adjusted and adjusted again. Team Anko ceased feeling newly assembled and became simply itself, a living structure now shaped as much by shared work as by initial design. Faces around the village changed in the subtle way they only do when one has seen them over enough months to notice growth rather than merely difference. Even Itachi's body, traitorously and mercifully, began catching up by increments with the mind inside it. Coordination improved, reach extended. The humiliating gap between perception and physical execution narrowed. Time was carrying everyone forward. And then, one evening, Hiruzen named what Itachi had already begun sensing beneath the surface. "We are reaching a transition point," the Hokage said. They met under familiar precautions, though by now those precautions had become less dramatic in Itachi's mind than ritual. Secrecy was no longer a shocking burden. It was infrastructure. "Explain," Itachi said. Hiruzen folded his hands. "What you and I changed in the immediate aftermath of the Nine Tails attack has had first-order effects. The Uchiha are more integrated. Naruto's burden remains concealed. Certain political habits have been interrupted before hardening. Your team has created useful consequences in the field, but that stage of intervention is ending." Because now came the larger ripples. Itachi understood before the old man fully said it. "People are adapting to the changed conditions," he said. "Yes, Danzo, Orochimaru, hidden networks on transit routes, the invisible reactions of forces not yet fully named. And beyond all of them, the eventual necessity of confronting Akatsuki not as a distant prophecy, but as an organization that would, sooner or later, start touching the world more directly, no matter how much had already changed." The first stage had been repair at the roots. The second, now arriving, would be something else entirely. Expansion, collision, strategic consequence on a wider board. Hiruzen saw the recognition settle. "You understand." Itachi looked down briefly, not in submission, but in concentration. "The future is no longer simply diverging from what I knew. It is generating its own momentum." That is one way to say it. Another way would have been harsher. "We have succeeded enough to enter uncertainty for real." The strange thing was that Itachi did not find the thought purely frightening. There was fear in it, yes. He was not foolish enough to mistake widening uncertainty for freedom. But there was also a severe kind of relief. The old timeline had once felt like a track already laid. Every warning he carried now a point at which some catastrophe merely awaited its proper cue. This new movement, unstable as it was, meant the world had stopped obeying old tragedy with such perfect discipline. That mattered. It also demanded new thinking. No more acting as though foreknowledge alone anchored strategy. From here onward, foreknowledge would be one tool among many, and not always the most reliable one. Observation in the present would matter more. Networks would matter more. Diplomacy, alliances, training, team formation, who trusted whom and why. Those quieter systems would now determine just as much as memory of what had once happened. A different war, perhaps. Or the same war learning a new language. After the strategic portion ended, Hiruzen watched him for a moment in silence. Then he said, "And in yourself?" A question he kept asking because he refused to let Itachi become all function again. Itachi considered longer than usual before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've stopped waiting for the old world to reassert itself exactly as it was." Hiruzen's eyes softened. "It might still resemble it," Itachi continued, "in places. But I no longer think of this as borrowed time before the inevitable. It's its own life now." That was the truth, and saying it aloud altered something. Because if this life was truly its own, then every decision ahead mattered not merely as prevention but as creation. They were no longer just stopping things from happening, they were authoring dangerous work, necessary work. When Itachi returned home, he found Sasuke asleep over a set of half-finished childish scribbles he had clearly intended to show off before sleep overcame him. Mikoto smiled when she saw Itachi looking at them and whispered, "He waited as long as he could." Fugaku, nearby, made some restrained comment about the boy's stubbornness clearly being inherited from a regrettable source, which made Mikoto suppress a laugh and Sasuke stir without fully waking. It was a tiny scene, almost insultingly small compared to the scale of everything waiting outside. And yet that too was the point. The next phase of the future would not be fought only in secret meetings, hostile networks, or eventual clashes with legendary enemies. It would also be fought here in whether homes remain homes, in whether children got to grow through ordinary things, in whether people like Sasuke could fall asleep over nonsense and still expect tomorrow to arrive without blood tearing through the walls. Itachi stood there in the dim warm light and understood the coming transition with brutal clarity. The first battle had been to keep this possibility alive. The next would be to expand it before the larger darkness of the world noticed just how much there now was to destroy. The darkness had already noticed. Not fully. Not with the focused hunger of a predator who had chosen its prey and committed to the kill, but in the way weather notices pressure shifts long before a storm breaks. The larger world was beginning to register that Konoha no longer moved exactly as expected. Small route networks disrupted. Minor patterns interrupted. Localized operations returning results a little too cleanly. The sort of thing no great power would announce and no careful enemy would ignore. That was the danger Hiruzen had named without dramatizing. The altered future was no longer merely a set of avoided mistakes. It was producing visible consequences. And visible consequences, given enough time, became signals. Itachi thought about that signal whenever Team Anko left the village now, not obsessively. He had learned that obsession only blurred the line between prudence and paralysis. But steadily, with the quiet persistence of someone who understood that once a pattern starts radiating outward, one must begin accounting not only for direct threats, but for who else might be reading the pattern from farther away. The team itself had changed enough by then that such thoughts no longer felt separate from fieldwork. Yagao read roads, people, and movement with increasing confidence. Anko, though still allergic to anything resembling wholesome mentorship, had become more effective precisely because she was no longer performing toughness for its own sake every hour of the day. She remained sharp, yes. Abrasive, absolutely. But she now spent more energy shaping them than testing whether they were worth shaping at all. This made her more dangerous. It also made her, to Itachi's quiet surprise, easier to respect openly in his own mind. He had always respected capability. Capability was simple. Capability earned recognition whether one liked the person wielding it or not. What had complicated his view of Anko early on was not competence, but inheritance. Too much of Orochimaru lived in the edges of her methods, her instincts, the moments when pressure became an answer faster than trust. But time with the team was revealing another truth. Damage inherited was not damage surrendered to. She kept choosing against some of what had shaped her, even when she did not yet have kinder language for the choice. That mattered. It mattered most on a mission that should have remained routine and instead turned instructive in a different way than the ambush had. The assignment was administrative by shinobi standards, escorting a sequence of message transfers across allied and semi-allied points, where village contact chains still relied on physical passage more than anyone liked to admit. Nothing glamorous. Mostly road, checkpoints, and people whose real skill lay in seeming too boring to rob. The sort of work that irritated ambitious shinobi and quietly kept nations functioning. Anko hated it on principle. "This," she said while they moved along a tree-shadowed section of road on the second morning, "is the kind of mission that teaches you why half the shinobi profession is logistics wearing weapons." Yugao did not look up from where she was monitoring the wagon path below them. "That sounds like useful knowledge." "It is useful," Anko muttered. "That's the insulting part." Itachi almost smiled. The mission would have passed into memory as little more than another example of competence under boredom if not for the checkpoint dispute. They arrived at a way station near midday and found the local contact chains stalled not by attack, but by mistrust. Two sets of personnel, each with legitimate-looking authorization and mutually incompatible instructions. One insisting that the message bundle had to be redirected along a more secure route because of irregular activity farther east. The other insisting that any unscheduled rerouting increased interception risk and violated standing protocol. Neither side was wrong enough to dismiss immediately, which meant the real danger was not combat, but manipulation. Anko saw it first in emotional terms. "They're both too certain," she murmured after observing the exchange from a slight distance. Not because they trust their orders, because they've each already been primed to think the other side smells wrong. Yugao frowned faintly. Then someone wants the chain to break itself. Exactly. Itachi stepped through the problem the way he always did. Authorization patterns, language consistency, timing, the credibility of stated route threats. Who gained if Konoha's internal communications started distrusting themselves? The answer, as usual, was not singular. Hidden networks. Opportunists. A larger enemy probing procedural fault lines. Perhaps even nothing more dramatic than lower-tier actors learning to exploit confusion because Konoha's recent vigilance had made direct theft less attractive. But what mattered tactically was immediate resolution. And here, for once, Itachi had to do almost nothing. Anko handled it, not with diplomacy in any polished sense, certainly not with softness, but with the brutal practicality of someone who understood institutions from the angle of what broke them under stress. She separated the two sides, made each account for exact timing and phrasing of instruction receipt, identified the one overlap both had failed to notice, and from there forced the contradiction into the open. One relay point further back had inserted urgency into one chain, but not the other, meaning either local miscommunication or deliberate contamination. No accusations, no grandstanding, just ruthless narrowing until the human beings involved stopped defending their pride and started helping solve the actual breach. Watching her, Itachi understood something else about her teaching style. It was not that she distrusted order. It was that she distrusted order not tested against sabotage. That was different, sharper, more useful. When the dispute was settled and the correct route preserved under revised verification, Yugao said quietly as they moved out again, "You enjoyed that." Anko looked personally insulted. "I enjoyed not strangling people. Big difference. You were smiling. I smile when idiots stop being expensive." Yugao's eyes shifted toward Itachi very briefly, as though inviting witness to the obvious lie. He declined to participate, which likely amused her more than saying anything would have. These tiny interactions were becoming one of the strangest comforts of the team, not because they were profound, because they weren't. In another life, he had spent too long in circles where every exchange carried agendas within agendas, where humor was rare and trust either weaponized or absent. Here, for all the danger, for all the secrecy still governing his wider purpose, there existed stretches of time in which people were simply themselves. Yugao dry and exacting, Anko chaotic and intolerably perceptive, himself increasingly unable to pretend that detachment was the only dignified posture available to someone carrying too much. And because such comfort existed, the next layer of threat cut deeper when it emerged. The reports from route disruptions, hidden networks, irregular transfer attempts, and low-level procedural contamination began aligning just enough that Hiruzen called for a more careful conversation. Not one of their brief check-ins, a fuller one. By then, the methods of secrecy between them had matured. There was less drama in arranging contact because drama itself created trace. Instead, it happened through habits so ordinary no one thought to question them. A schedule that looked like errands, clones where clones could plausibly exist for unrelated work. Visual confirmation embedded in places where a Hokage or a promising young shinobi might each reasonably appear without the overlap seeming suspicious. They met in such a space now, transformed just enough to reduce recognition and carrying on, outwardly, a conversation no more alarming than village administration. Hiruzen's face, however, told the truth. "The route networks are not isolated," he said. Itachi had suspected as much. Hearing it confirmed still tightened something in him. Connected how? Through intermediaries we have not fully identified, some independent, some likely hired. The pattern suggests overlapping channels, information leakage, route pressure, and selective redirection. Not Akatsuki's grand operations. Not yet, something lower. But lower did not mean harmless. Hidden logistics sustained bigger predators. Anyone capable of quietly altering the flow of information, personnel, or goods across a region could become either a tool or a threat to powers far above their apparent scale. "It's organized enough to matter," Itachi said. "Yes." "Do you think it's tied to one village?" Hiruzen's eyes narrowed fractionally. "No. That would almost be simpler. Mercenary nodes then? Independent broker lines. Proto-networks that larger actors might later absorb. The shinobi world was full of such structures in the shadows between formal power blocks. He had always known that. What changed now was proximity. Instead of being distant background to future war, these systems were becoming visible early because Konoha had begun resisting small vulnerabilities before they matured into routine. Success had lit hidden machinery. That was useful. It was also dangerous because hidden machinery, once illuminated, did not always sit politely and wait to be dismantled. "We'll need broader coordination," Itachi said. Hiruzen looked at him carefully. You mean intelligence coordination or political coordination? Both eventually, Itachi replied. If these channels cross borders, then village-level responses alone will only trim branches. The Hokage's expression changed subtly at that, not surprise, recognition. This was the first stage of something Itachi had sensed approaching, the need to think beyond Konoha's immediate correction and toward the larger continental consequences of success. The village could not save itself forever in isolation if the wider board kept generating instability around it. At some point, secret knowledge and internal reform had to become diplomacy, leverage, alliance, or preemption. The problem, of course, was timing. Too soon, and they exposed themselves or triggered suspicion. Too late, and hidden systems hardened into stronger enemy positions. Hiruzen folded his hands. I agree. But we are not yet at the stage where open coordination would help more than it alarms. No, not yet. The other villages would hear early warnings through the filter of old rivalries. Every message would be weighed for advantage, manipulation, and weakness. And if Konoha mishandled the transition from internal vigilance to external outreach, it could create exactly the strategic paranoia Akatsuki and similar actors thrived on. So for now, the work remained layered. Quiet intelligence expansion, narrow trust lines, more monitoring, more pattern building, and Team Anko, though far from the center of this larger machine, continued becoming one of the small instruments through which those patterns were gathered. This changed their missions again, though not in title. Titles remained modest. Assessments, escorts, verifications, rural follow-ups. But inside those mission frames, Anko's instructions grew more exacting, and Yigao's observations increasingly began contributing not only to immediate objectives, but to broader interpretation. Itachi found himself doing what he had promised. Hiruzen he would not let become too dominant, using the team as a stabilizing intelligence organ rather than merely a tactical unit. The key was to do it without hollowing out their humanity. That remained the line everything meaningful depended on. Yigao, especially, was growing into a shinobi whose mind could easily be recruited too far into clean efficiency. She saw systems beautifully. She understood compromise points. She could become, if encouraged badly enough, exactly the sort of operative villages adored because she would solve delicate problems with precision and little complaint. Itachi recognized the danger because he had once embodied its endpoint in another form. So when opportunities arose, he made certain to keep some of their learning grounded in people rather than abstraction, not by speeches. He would rather have bitten through his tongue, by attention, by making sure debriefs included why a civilian contact had behaved as they did, not only how, by asking questions that required motives and constraints, not just tactical outcomes, by refusing, subtly but persistently, to let every village problem become a puzzle detached from the lies caught inside it. Anko, unexpectedly, sometimes reinforced this. Once, after a mission where a local guard post had nearly ruined its own security through exhaustion and bad communication, Yigao summarized the failure in purely procedural terms. Anko listened, then said, "All true. Now explain it again while remembering they haven't had enough people for their assigned coverage in 3 months, and their commander's trying to stop a theft problem with half a staff and no budget." Yigao blinked. "That doesn't excuse the failure," she said. "No," Anko replied. "It explains why the failure happened. If you want to keep making sense of the world after people start bleeding in it, learn the difference." Itachi stored that exchange carefully, because there it was again, that rough, broken, invaluable thing in Anko that understood systems from underneath, where strain and fear and scarcity worked behavior long before ideology or villainy arrived to claim responsibility. Perhaps that was why the team kept working. None of them alone would have produced quite this moral shape. Yigao might have gone too clean. Anko might have gone too hard. Itachi, left unwatched, might have gone too cold in the name of protecting everyone. Together, they kept catching one another's worst tendencies before they could harden into method. That realization should have reassured him. Instead, it sharpened another fear, because the more valuable the team became, not in the village's official records, but in the hidden geometry of who made whom better, the more catastrophic losing any piece of it would be. He tried not to think like that. Tried not to look at Anko and imagine what Orochimaru might yet do if their paths crossed again. Tried not to look at Yigao and see the future A and BU who, in another life, might be fed into darkness by the same system that praised her composure. Tried not to look at Sasuke and calculate. Above all, tried not to calculate. This was the hardest battle of the second life so far, not against enemies, but against the mind's addiction to pre-loss, to treating all love as eventual casualty data with emotional preliminaries attached. Hiruzen noticed. Of course he noticed. During another meeting, after they had discussed route networks, village responses, and the first whispers that other hidden villages were also seeing irregularities in lower-tier movement channels, the Hokage simply asked, "What do you fear most right now?" Itachi almost said Akatsuki. It would have been a defensible answer, even a true one, in part, but not the truest. Misreading the stage we're entering, he said after a long pause. The first phase was local enough that intervention felt tangible. The next one is larger, less obedient to any one person's knowledge. Hiruzen nodded once, waiting. And because it's larger, Itachi continued, the people near me feel more exposed. There, closer. The old man studied him with that infuriating gentleness again. Then remember this, larger does not always mean less controllable. Sometimes it just means more people must help carry it. A simple sentence, almost annoyingly so. And yet it struck at the exact place where the old logic still lived inside him. Larger danger once meant larger isolation. More needed doing, therefore fewer people could be trusted with the truth. Therefore, the burden narrowed onto whoever could bear the ugliest parts. Hiruzen kept refusing that arithmetic, refusing to let scale automatically produce sacrifice of the old kind. The question was whether the world itself would permit such refusal for long. At home, time continued its quiet work. Sasuke's speech sharpened. His emotions became more specific. His little rivalries and little triumphs gained form. He no longer simply adored Itachi in the diffuse, total way of a very small child. He was beginning to compare, aspire, pout, imitate with purpose. That was healthy, wonderful even. It was also proof that childhood was moving forward, regardless of how fiercely Itachi might wish to shield certain moments from ending. Mikoto once laughed softly while watching Sasuke insist on doing something just like Nissan, then said, almost to herself, "He's starting to become himself now." The comment stayed with Itachi for days. Because that was the whole point, wasn't it? Not to freeze people in innocence, to let them become themselves without first being destroyed. The Uchiha district, too, was becoming itself differently. Market contact had begun reshaping habits at a level deeper than surface convenience. Civilian familiarity no longer felt like intrusion every time. Merchant ties softened edges that pride alone had kept too hard. Fugaku still thought in terms of clan dignity, as he always would, but increasingly that dignity now had practical integration to express itself through, rather than only resentment at distance. None of this meant safety. It meant possibility. And possibility, he was learning, could be more terrifying than inevitability because failure inside possibility felt less like fate and more like waste. That understanding followed him into the moment he first truly sensed the next horizon. It came not in combat, nor in secret meeting, nor in any political chamber. It came while Team Anko stood above a valley road at dusk, observing movement patterns tied to one of the newer route anomalies. The mission had yielded little immediate confirmation, but the view was wide enough that several trade lines, local paths, and hidden approach options all lay visible in one glance. Yigao was noting timings. Anko was muttering about how anyone using the lower route after dark was either desperate or stupid. Itachi looked outward and saw, all at once, not merely a mission space, but a networked world. Routes crossing routes. Villages leaning on invisible lines of trust and theft. Information moving like blood through vessels no single map fully captured. Small actors feeding larger ones. Local instability rippling towards strategic consequence. And somewhere beyond even that, the eventual convergence of great powers, hidden organizations, and personal vendettas that would decide whether the age ahead belonged to survival or collapse. The scale of it hit him cleanly then. The future they were entering would not be won by one village repairing itself alone, not even by one brilliant plan. It would require layers, people, networks of trust wider than old loyalties comfortably allowed. Quiet preparation becoming open strategy at exactly the right time. The kind of work that took years and still failed if pride, secrecy, or fear were allowed to rule too long. In other words, it would require almost everything the first life had taught the shinobi world not to do. Anko said something then, sharp, impatient, probably about route behavior, and Ye Gao responded with dry precision, and the moment folded back into ordinary mission rhythm. But Itachi carried the recognition with him on the walk home. The stage had expanded again. Not tomorrow, perhaps not even in a way the village could publicly name yet, but undeniably. The hidden networks were only the beginning. Soon enough, Akatsuki would no longer be a distant catastrophe waiting at the edge of prophecy. It would become an active force within a world already shifting under altered conditions. When that happened, the difference between a prepared continent and an isolated village could define everything. He entered the house that night more quietly than usual. Sasuke was asleep. Mikoto looked tired in the soft domestic way of a parent whose day had been full rather than tragic. Fugaku sat with a document he was not truly reading, his attention sharper than the page deserved. Ordinary life. Again. The same miracle and vulnerability as ever. Itachi stood there for a moment and realized that the question ahead was no longer simply how to keep Konoha from repeating its old sins. The question was how to widen this pocket of changed fate before the larger world closed around it, and that meant, sooner rather than later, they would have to stop thinking only like survivors of one village's future. They would have to start thinking like architects of many. The phrase stayed with Itachi in a way tactical conclusions rarely did. Tactical conclusions had edges. They fit into the hand. Do this, don't do that, trust here, watch there, move sooner, move later, reveal this, conceal that. Even impossible situations often became livable once translated into sequence. But this was larger than sequence. Architecture implied design that outlasted moments. It implied systems, interdependence, load-bearing choices made early enough that later pressures would either hold or collapse depending on how well the unseen structure beneath them had been arranged. That was what Hiruzen was beginning to understand too. Konoha's first corrections had been local, intimate, almost surgical. Protect Naruto from becoming a village scapegoat before the role could calcify around him. Keep the Uchiha woven into village life instead of isolating them until resentment had room to mythologize itself. Use Itachi's knowledge to identify future fractures before they hardened into inevitabilities. All of that had mattered, all of it still mattered. But none of it, by itself, could answer the question of what happened when the wider continent began moving under the pressure of altered history. And the continent was moving. Not dramatically enough that civilians would name it. Not cleanly enough that any single report could prove it. But the signs were there for anyone positioned close to the right seams. Hidden routes expanding beyond local use. Brokerage networks intersecting with border anxieties. Small destabilizations appearing where old sequences no longer quite aligned. The world was adjusting to Konoha's changes without yet understanding their source, like water meeting a rock that had not existed the first time the current passed through. Itachi thought about that while Team Anko trained, while they traveled, while Yigao grew more precise, and Anko more dangerous in all the best and worst ways. But most of all, he thought about it in the spaces between official action, because architecture begins before anyone admits a building is underway. The Chunin exams, when the idea first surfaced in Hiruzen's planning, did not arrive as spectacle in his mind. They arrived as cover. That was the brilliance of the concept. Not the exams themselves. Those were an old institution, part theater, part talent filtration, part diplomatic signaling exercise disguised as meritocracy. Every village understood their formal purpose. That was precisely what made them useful. A gathering structured around rivalry, youth, and public demonstration allowed quieter movements to occur beneath the expected noise. Delegations came. Observers came. Instructors and village officials mingled within the plausible chaos of competition. Conversations could begin in spaces where overt strategic summits would have triggered more suspicion than trust. Hiruzen did not present the idea to Itachi as a grand revelation. He mentioned it during one of their private exchanges, the way a man might lay a blade on the table and ask whether its weight felt right. If we need broader alignment, the Hokage said, then we need a setting where broader contact does not immediately declare itself as fear. Itachi understood at once. The exams. Yes. Not just as a shinobi institution, as controlled diplomatic terrain. A place to pull certain leaders, instructors, and observers into the same orbit while each could still pretend they were there primarily for ordinary reasons. It would not solve distrust. It would not magically create alliance. But it could begin something quieter and therefore more durable. Familiarity, overlapping conversations, the first careful exchange of concern around irregular networks and rising instability without anyone yet having to expose their entire hand. It's early, Itachi said. It is. Too early? Hiruzen's eyes, old and steady and annoyingly difficult to read when he had already made up his mind halfway, rested on him for a moment. That depends on whether you think we are trying to warn them of one enemy or prepare them for a change in the nature of threat itself. That was the true question, wasn't it? If Akatsuki were merely an eventual rogue organization, then timing could perhaps remain tied to direct evidence, to visible escalation, to the old sequence. But if the problem was broader, if the continent itself was entering an age where hidden structures, manipulated routes, masked actors, mercenary lines, and ideological predators would intersect more dynamically because the old future had already been disrupted, then waiting for certainty was just a refined form of surrender. Still, timing mattered. Too much urgency and the other villages would smell either weakness or attempted manipulation. Too little, and the chance would pass into another ordinary exam cycle with nothing gained but performance and rivalry. It can't be framed as warning, Itachi said finally. Not yet. That would make them retreat into old instincts. It has to be framed as concern over irregular instability, shared enough to matter, vague enough to invite discussion instead of immediate denial. Hiruzen smiled faintly. That is also my assessment. Of course it was. So the architecture began. Not publicly, never that bluntly. Through correspondence choices, through which observers were quietly encouraged to attend. Through what kinds of irregular activity were allowed to filter outward as rumor versus which were formalized into report. Through preliminary conversations arranged around logistics security coordination and standard host responsibilities that could later widen into something more substantial once the right people were already in the same rooms, already acknowledging the same anomalies, already invested enough in face-saving to avoid simply dismissing one another outright. It was elegant in a way Itachi distrusted and admired simultaneously. Because this was politics at its most useful and most dangerous, not lies exactly, but environments shaped so that certain truths could emerge under better conditions than naked honesty would have allowed. A less damaged man might have found that merely clever. Itachi, who had seen too often what good reasons could justify, kept watching for the line where architecture became manipulation for its own sake. Hiruzen watched for that line too. That helped. It also helped that their purpose, this time, was not containment of one clan or sacrifice of one child, but expansion of a fragile possibility. That did not make the methods pure. It made them worth the moral discomfort they caused. Team Anko, meanwhile, remained outside the center of those diplomatic preparations, while still feeding the intelligence currents that justified them. Their assignments kept circling root pressure, local anomalies, communication integrity, and the human debris produced by hidden systems. Sometimes that meant actual field contact. Sometimes it meant long, dull stretches of observation that only mattered because dullness made pattern shifts visible. More than once it meant dealing with frightened civilians or local officials whose primary role in larger instability was not villainy but exhaustion. That mattered to Itachi, perhaps more than it should have from a strategic perspective. But architecture built without respect for human limits eventually treated collapse as personal failure instead of structural consequence. Anko understood that more and more openly now. One rainy evening after a mission that had ended not in combat, but in a miserable sequence of corrections around a compromised relay point, Yigao summarized the problem crisply. Insufficient redundancy, poor oversight, delayed verification. They created their own vulnerability. Anko wrung water from her sleeve and snorted. True, also they've been operating 3 posts with the manpower for 1.5 their messages are late because someone upstream decided temporary strain was cheaper to ignore than fix. Yigao frowned slightly. That still doesn't make the errors acceptable. No, Anko said, it makes them predictable, which is worse. Itachi looked at her then, really looked, and felt again that strange respect deepen. Because predictability born of strain was exactly how villages failed their own people before ever naming an enemy. People asked too much, gave too little, called the resulting breakage weakness, then built policy on top of the wound. Orochimaru had done it to students. Danzo did it to systems. Konoha had once done it to the Uchiha. Everywhere he looked now, the same principle waited in smaller forms. If this new future had any chance at all, they would need to stop building power around predictable human collapse and calling it necessity. That thought lingered while the exams drew closer. The village shifted under the preparation. Buildings cleaned. Routes recalculated. Security layered more carefully, but also more subtly, in the places that mattered. Younger shinobi felt the rising current of prestige and competition without understanding the larger diplomatic weight settling around the event. Instructors grew busier. Clan leaders more attentive. Visiting standards, hospitality, reputation, optics, all the ritual machinery of inter-village performance spun up exactly as tradition expected. And underneath it, a second event assembled itself. That second event did not have a banner. It lived in seating choices, invitation lists, who would happen to be present during certain discussions, which reports were quietly placed where they might be seen by the right pair of eyes rather than the wrong 10. It lived in the difference between an exam host merely proving village strength and an old Hokage slowly creating the conditions for his counterparts and their representatives to admit without loss of face that the world had become harder to read lately. Itachi remained only partly inside this layer, as Hiruzen intended. He was too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to overexpose. The more explicitly he stood near the hidden architecture, the more traceable its design might become. So Hiruzen used him where appropriate advice, pattern assessment, caution against old timelines that no longer perfectly mapped, but refused to make him central in the visible mechanisms. At first, Itachi found that frustrating. Then he recognized it for what it was, protection through distribution. Another thing the first life had rarely granted him. Another thing the second was quietly insisting upon. His own role during the exam period would remain modest on the surface. Genin, member of an increasingly promising team, participant only where rank and timing naturally allowed, That meant observing more than directing, which, perhaps, was best. Architecture reveals itself better from certain angles when one is not standing in the middle of it trying to hold every beam by hand. The delegations began arriving. Each village brought its own weather with it. Not literal weather, though sometimes it felt that way. A tone, a rhythm of movement. Hidden cloud with its charged edge of power and pride. Stone in its heavy patience. Mist shaped by its own cold habits. Sand quieter than many outsiders realized, but no less observant for that silence. Even the smaller presences had their own textures, their own calibrations of confidence and caution. Itachi watched them the way one watches converging fronts before deciding whether they will collide, pass harmlessly, or change one another in ways neither intended. Team Anko had limited direct contact at first, but limited did not mean meaningless. Anko, inevitably, refused to become polite just because foreign shinobi were present. If anything, she seemed to find the performance environment personally offensive and responded by becoming even more aggressively herself, which in practice meant she was impossible to dismiss. Yagao handled the change differently, tightening into an even more controlled version of her usual composure. She looked, Itachi thought once, like the sort of shinobi foreign instructors would notice and remember without necessarily realizing why. And he kept feeling eyes. Not constantly, not dramatically, just often enough. A prodigy among home village circles became one thing. A prodigy in the orbit of visiting shinobi became another. Stories traveled faster during examinations. So did assessments. Who was promising? Who was overhyped? Who was dangerous? Who might, in 10 years, matter too much to leave underestimated? No one said these calculations aloud, of course. But Itachi had lived too long among shinobi not to recognize the way professionals looked at children when trying to decide whether they were seeing mere talent or the beginning of future political weight. It was unpleasant. It was also useful because the same attention falling on him often fell, by association, on Team Anko. That mattered for more than ego. Teams noticed by others gained narrative existence. Once a foreign shinobi had mentally tagged them as worth remembering, future contact or rumor could build on that recognition. A small thing. Many structures begin as small things. The first meaningful intersection between the visible exam world and Hiruzen's quieter architecture came not in a formal chamber but during a security coordination meeting adjacent to it. The kind of gathering no outsider would find especially remarkable. Host representatives, visiting liaisons, route concern acknowledgements, standard risk reviews dressed in enough bureaucratic language to reassure everyone that nothing truly alarming need be admitted. Except, this time, certain route anomalies were admitted. Not fully, not with maps spread and secrets surrendered, but enough. Enough for representatives from more than one village to indicate they had seen comparable irregularities, low-level route pressure, unexplained relay disruption, deniable networks moving information or goods under weak covers. Nothing pointing cleanly to one shared enemy. Everything pointing to a shift in the background texture of threat. This was the opening Hiruzen had engineered. No panic, no accusations. Just several parties, each still wary, each still protecting face, forced gently into acknowledging that the same small rot had appeared in too many places to dismiss as isolated local inconvenience. Itachi did not sit in that room. He heard about it later, in measured summary, because Hiruzen intended him to understand the consequence without needing to be seen near the mechanism itself. They didn't align, the Hokage said afterward. No, Itachi replied, but they recognized overlap. Yes, that was enough for a first movement. Overlap meant future conversations could happen without beginning from total denial. Overlap meant that when larger threats eventually surfaced, some minds in other villages would already have places to fit the new information. They would not be hearing "the world is changing" as an entirely foreign proposition. Someone had already nudged the architecture of their expectations. And yet for all the importance of that success, Itachi's attention kept returning to something else. The children. Not just Sasuke, though Sasuke remained the center of all his private fear and tenderness. The exam grounds, the visiting delegations, the young shinobi being watched, measured, evaluated, praised, compared. Everywhere Itachi looked, he saw how easily villages turned youth into forecast and forecast into pressure. Some wore it proudly. Some hid it. Some had already learned to smile while being weighed. Others still believed competition was only competition, and not also an early sorting mechanism through which futures would be distributed with uneven mercy. In another life, he had been one of those children, and too exceptional to be left alone by any system built to use excellence. This time he stood slightly outside the main axis of the examinations and saw more clearly the machinery beneath it. That made him protective in new directions. One afternoon, after a training display that had drawn more attention than Team Anko likely deserved on paper, Yagao noticed his distraction and asked, "What are you thinking?" He answered more honestly than intended. That everyone is being watched for the wrong reasons, and the right ones at the same time. She glanced across the grounds, where younger competitors and instructors moved through patterns of ambition and anxiety. That sounds like you've decided to dislike the entire institution. I don't dislike it. Then what? Itachi searched for language that would not sound absurd coming from someone his apparent age. It's useful, he said finally. But usefulness changes people, sometimes before they know it's happening. Yagao looked at him for a long moment, then said, with unusual gentleness, "That sounds like experience, not theory." He gave her nothing more. She did not press. That, too, was part of why he trusted her now. Anko, on the other hand, pressed where she pleased and called it balance. Later that same evening, when the three of them stood on a roofline assigned to rotational watch, she stretched, grimaced at some old ache she would never dignify by naming, and said, "You've been making that stupid face all day." "It's just his face," Yagao said. "No, his normal face is worse. This is the one he makes when he's trying to save the world through disapproval." Itachi closed his eyes briefly. "You're both insufferable." Anko grinned. "See? Much better. That's a real person talking." The exchange should have meant nothing. It meant too much. Because they had become, despite everything, a place where he could be nudged back into personhood when he drifted too far toward function. And function had once eaten almost everything good in him. The exams continued. The diplomatic undercurrent held. No sudden alliance formed. No miraculous trust bloomed across old rivalries. But lines had been drawn where before there had only been vague mistrust. More importantly, those lines crossed. Certain representatives now knew which others had also seen hidden root anomalies. Certain instructors now knew that local instability was no longer quite a local phrase. A few key minds had shifted from isolated suspicion to shared concern. Architecture, not a completed building, a framework. Toward the end of the exam period, Hiruzen and Itachi met again. The old man looked more tired than usual, which meant the effort behind his calm had increased considerably. Yet there was satisfaction in him too. Careful, incomplete, but real. "It began well," Hiruzen said. Itachi understood the exact meaning. "And ended with fewer walls than it started with." That was perhaps the best one could hope for at this stage. They reviewed who had responded how, which villages might prove more receptive later, where pride remained too hard to approach directly, where indirect channels might be better. No names were overcommitted, no expectations romanticized. This was not peace building. It was precondition building. More fragile, more thankless, and in some ways more important. Then Hiruzen, because he never let strategy stand alone for too long, asked, "And what did you learn?" Itachi answered without much pause this time. "That architecture can work without control." The Hokage's brows rose slightly. "I thought," Itachi continued, "that if something of this scale was going to hold, it would require constant direct correction. But it doesn't. Not entirely. Sometimes it's enough to shape the conditions and let other people arrive at what they're ready to admit." A small smile touched Hiruzen's mouth. "A difficult lesson for someone like you." Yes, it was. Because it meant accepting that not every important outcome needed to originate from his own action. Some only needed his action to make them more possible. The difference between being foundation and being center. Between architecture and obsession. When he returned home that night, the village felt the way it often did after major events. Not quieter exactly, but exhaled. The intensity that had held everything taut was easing. Delegations would depart, rumors would spread, assessments would travel outward. And somewhere inside those outward motions, the subtle second event Hiruzen had built would continue rippling long after the formal exams themselves were forgotten. Sasuke met him with immediate demands for news, as if the entire gathering of foreign shinobi had existed primarily to produce stories for him. Mikoto told him not to overwhelm his brother the instant he stepped in the door. Fugaku said something dry about discipline clearly not surviving first contact with family. Ordinary life again. Miraculously ordinary. Itachi stood there, listened, answered, and felt the truth settle more solidly than before. The future ahead would not belong to one village alone, but neither would this home survive by becoming abstract in his mind. That had been one of his first life's deepest failures, allowing the language of village, peace, and necessity to become so large that the actual home inside those words could be destroyed and still called saved. He would not make that mistake again. Architecture at the continental level meant nothing if the rooms inside it were empty. Later, after Sasuke finally slept and the house softened into night, Itachi looked out across Konoha and thought about what had changed. Not enough to relax, enough to matter. The Uchiha still lived. Naruto was still protected from a burden the village had once thrust upon him too early and too cruelly. Team Anko had become real. The first threads of broader inter-village recognition had been tied. And somewhere beyond the horizon of all that, Akatsuki still waited, the masked man still moved, Orochimaru still built whatever future his ambition required. The darkness had not receded. But the world it would meet now was no longer as isolated, as blind, or as fractured as before. That, Itachi thought, might be the first genuine strategic advantage his second life had ever created on a continental scale. And if that was true, then the next phase would not be about beginning anymore. It would be about holding what had been built when the real pressure finally came. Pressure never announced itself as the real pressure. That was the first mistake. Stories taught people. They made turning points look clean in retrospect. This was the moment. This was the warning. This was the hour after which everything changed. Real life was rarely so considerate. Pressure accumulated. It settled into routines, into information, into glances and delays and shifted patterns no one outside the right circles could quite name. Then one day, people looked up and realized the world had not snapped in half. It had tightened around them so gradually they had mistaken adaptation for safety. Itachi understood that now with a clarity he had not possessed even in the first life. Back then, he had often experienced history as mandate. Events arrived loaded with inevitability because the adults around him, and then the institutions around them, kept treating crisis like a narrowing corridor until only one bloodstained path remained visible. In this life, history felt different. Not kinder, not easier, simply less obedient to a single script. And because it was less obedient, the burden of interpreting pressure had become heavier, not lighter. One could no longer say, this is how it happens, so this is what comes next. One had to look at the shape of the world as it actually was, now, and decide. That was what made the months after the exams so strange. On the surface, life remained almost offensively ordinary. Delegations left, rumors scattered. People resumed talking about talent, rankings, embarrassing performances, surprising outcomes, village impressions, the public residue such events always left behind. Shopkeepers cared about the short economic afterglow. Instructors argued about training standards. Children reenacted fragments of what they had seen or heard and got half of it wrong in ways that made adults alternately fond and exasperated. Beneath that, however, the architecture Hiruzen had built during the exams continued doing exactly what good architecture did. It held, not dramatically, not with letters arriving proclaiming alliance or envoys begging Konoha to lead some grand coalition, nothing so foolish. But the hidden route irregularities no longer belonged to isolated village rumor. When new disturbances appeared, certain actors in other villages now had a mental frame into which the reports could fit. Questions, once easy to dismiss as local inconvenience, began receiving slightly less dismissive handling. A few security exchanges happened faster. A few conversations between the right kinds of people met less total resistance than they would have before. Tiny differences. Tiny differences had already saved an entire clan. Itachi kept reminding himself of that whenever impatience threatened to sharpen into contempt. The old world inside him still wanted visible leverage, clean strategic movement, certainty that efforts translated into measurable protective gains. But certainty was often the privilege of hindsight, not the companion of action. He had chosen architecture. Architecture demanded patience with invisible weight-bearing. Team Anko provided a different kind of proof. They were no longer a curiosity. No longer merely a hastily reassembled unit performing slightly above expectation because its instructor was volatile and one of its genin happened to be alarmingly gifted. They had become dependable enough that assignments now came with an unspoken assumption of adaptation. Nothing officially beyond their rank, but enough complexity, enough autonomy, enough trust in their ability to identify when routine had become false cover, that Itachi could feel the village's regards settling differently around them. That should have worried him more than it did. Perhaps because he had learned something important in the months since first joining them. Being valued was not the same as being used. The line could still blur, he would never be careless about that. But the answer was not to reject usefulness outright. The answer was to stay vigilant about the terms under which usefulness was demanded. Anko, surprisingly, helped with that, not by intent, or not entirely by intent. She simply had no patience for narrative worship of shinobi sacrifice, especially when voiced by people who would not themselves be bled by the consequences. Her cynicism, when properly read, functioned as a kind of immune system against the village's most self-flattering lies. Once, after a mission summary in which a senior shinobi praised their willingness to push beyond age expectations, Anko waited until they were well outside earshot and muttered, "Anybody who says that about children should be slapped with a fish." Iga blinked. A fish? The slimy kind, with bones. Itachi looked at her. She glared back as if daring him to sentimentalize the point. What? If you're actually good, they'll keep wanting more. That doesn't make wanting more noble. No, it didn't. That one sentence held more practical morality than half the formal doctrines shinobi villages fed their own. Capability invited demand. Demand dressed itself as faith, duty, necessity, or admiration depending on which disguise would make acceptance easiest. But demand remained demand. The important thing was whether the person being demanded from had room to refuse, to distribute, to remain a person under the praise. Team Anko, oddly enough, had become one of the few places in Itachi's life where such room existed. Because Yegao would notice imbalance before it grew too large. Because Anko distrusted any arrangement in which one person's exceptionalism became everyone else's excuse to stop thinking. And because Itachi himself, having finally learned the taste of ordinary happiness, was no longer quite so willing to vanish into function just because the world found it efficient. Ordinary happiness. Even now, the phrase startled him. Not because it had become false, because it had become true often enough to feel dangerous. Sasuke was the clearest proof of that danger. He was changing in small, relentless ways that made time feel both merciful and cruel. His speech had lost some of its softer muddle and gained intention. His pride was no longer only adorable impulse. It was beginning to connect to effort imitation and the first real awareness that his older brother was not simply a constant of the universe, but someone whose qualities might be chased. Envied, matched, or failed to match. He wanted to know things now, not merely because curiosity struck him, but because knowledge felt like a path toward becoming. That should have been a simple joy. It was a joy. It also terrified Itachi with the precision of a knife laid gently against skin. Because now the question was no longer just whether Sasuke would survive with innocence intact. No child deserved eternal innocence. The question was, what shape of becoming the world would offer him? The old timeline had given him grief, isolation, and hatred sharpened into identity. This one, so far, had given him warmth, family, and a village less eager to poison him through inherited fracture. Would that be enough? No single future could ever be guaranteed enough, which was why Itachi had stopped trying to preserve moments as if preservation meant freezing them. Mikoto had been right, though she did not know the full weight of what she'd said the night she observed Sasuke starting to become himself. Becoming was the whole point. Protection that denied becoming was only another form of fear disguised as love. So Itachi did the harder thing. He let Sasuke become louder, more insistent, more competitive, more vividly himself. Let him fail at small things without overcorrecting. Let him chase, let him pout, let him test. Let him live inside a house where the walls did not hum with political panic and where his brother, though still too composed for any child's good, was present enough to answer questions rather than disappear into abstraction. There were evenings when that simple presence felt holier than any strategic victory. And because it felt that way, Itachi knew with brutal certainty what the enemy had to do if they ever wanted to unmake him. They would not need only to threaten Konoha, or Akatsuki, or the abstract stability of the continent. They would need to threaten home. That was the shape of vulnerability now. Also the shape of strength. The route networks continued yielding fragments. Not decisive breakthroughs, but enough to prove that the hidden systems threading between villages, markets, and deniable intermediaries were not receding. If anything, some were adapting under pressure, cleaning up after themselves faster, shifting transfer points, using more human ambiguity and less physical signature. This, too, was instructive. Networks capable of adaptation under low-level scrutiny often meant one of two things: either decentralized actors with strong survival instincts, or larger guidance from someone whose real expertise lay elsewhere but whose interests now intersected with these channels. Neither possibility comforted him. One mission in particular drove the point home. Team Anko was sent to verify a cluster of seemingly unrelated complaints around delayed relay timing, missing small value supplies, and contradictory route usage in a semi-rural corridor with just enough strategic relevance to matter and just enough administrative neglect to be dangerous. On paper, again, it looked like irritation, theft, and incompetence. In practice, the moment they began pulling at the threads, the pattern emerged. Not a grand conspiracy. Something more insidious. Multiple minor actors were feeding off the same weakening system without necessarily coordinating directly. A petty broker redirecting information for private gain. A local contact omitting delays to avoid disciplinary review. A transport hand-skimming supplies because he assumed shortages would be blamed on route instability anyway. Each individual offense small enough to rationalize. Together, enough to create noise in which more serious tampering could hide. Yugao summarized the pattern neatly once they had mapped it. Everyone assumed the system was already compromised, so they treated that compromise as cover for their own opportunism. Anko scratched at the back of her neck and gave a disgusted grunt. That's village rot in one sentence, yeah. Itachi looked over the corridor below them and felt a familiar chill settle into recognition. This was how larger darkness prepared its ground. Not always through direct violence first, through normalization of small corruption, through enough tolerated distortion that when a real predator moved through the system later, it found the structure already softened, already accustomed to lying to itself. That lesson was not new to him. What was new was the realization that he no longer wanted only to intercept the predator. He wanted to harden the structure against self-deception before the predator arrived. That was the full shift, wasn't it? The one perhaps marking the true end of the first phase of his second life. He was no longer reacting primarily to memory. He was responding to present reality with a mind informed by memory, yes, but not ruled by it. The world no longer needed him merely as a witness from a ruined timeline. It needed him as a participant in this one. The difference humbled him more than it exhilarated. It also made him lonelier in ways he had not expected, because he could feel himself crossing a threshold no one else around him quite saw. To Yigao, the maturing root analysis and field complexity meant professional growth. To Anko, it meant the world proving again that stupidity and hidden malice reproduced faster than good systems if left unattended. To Hiruzen, it meant the larger architecture slowly justifying the risks he had taken in believing an impossible child. To Itachi, it meant all of that and one more thing. It meant there would be no returning to the emotional logic of borrowed time. This life was not a rehearsal for the old world's return. It was a widening reality that would now produce its own tragedies if mishandled. Different ones, perhaps. Some familiar, some entirely new. His task had changed accordingly. No longer stop the massacre, stop Akatsuki, save Sasuke in a straight line. Now it was build, reinforce, widen, correct, choose. More moral agency, less comforting inevitability. That was harder. It was also, in a severe and almost frightening way, more just. Because no one could now say he had merely repeated or avoided prophecy. Whatever came next would be, increasingly, the result of what they built. This thought accompanied him into one of his last major private conversations with Hiruzen before the present edge of their story sharpened into true uncertainty. They met under all the same precautions, but neither of them treated the ritual as remarkable anymore. It had become part of the hidden bloodstream of his future. Hiruzen listened as Itachi laid out his newest assessment. The route irregularities were no longer best understood as one coherent enemy structure. They were becoming an ecosystem. Some actors connected, some merely opportunistic, all contributing to a continental environment more favorable to manipulation, covert movement, and strategic deniability. This did not replace the threat of Akatsuki. It prepared the ground on which organizations like Akatsuki would move more effectively when they did act. When he finished, the Hokage was quiet for a time. Then he said, "Which means?" "It means the next conflict won't begin where people think it begins," Itachi answered. "By the time the larger enemy becomes visible, the infrastructure enabling them may already feel normal." Hiruzen's face tightened subtly. "And can that be prevented?" "Not fully. That would have been a comforting lie. It can be interrupted," Itachi said. "Localized, made less seamless, made expensive. And if enough villages stop treating these hidden degradations as isolated inconvenience, then when the larger threat surfaces, it won't meet a continent starting from zero." The old man nodded slowly. "Architecture again, no single wall, 100 reinforcements. No final answer. A reduction of collapse probability through accumulated structural honesty." "And you?" Hiruzen asked, because of course he did. Itachi almost smiled despite himself. This time, he didn't evade. "I'm afraid," he said. The admission landed plainly between them. "Of failure?" Hiruzen asked. "Yes, but not in the old way." The Hokage waited. "Before, failure always felt tied to one future I could see, one sequence I knew. Now, he searched for the cleanest truth. Now failure could mean losing something genuinely new, something we created, not just something we failed to prevent." For a moment, Hiruzen looked not like Hokage, not like strategist, but simply like an old man hearing a child describe adulthood too early. "That," he said softly, "is the price of hope maturing into responsibility." Itachi held the words in silence. Then Hiruzen added, "It is also a better price than despair." Yes, it was. Painful, unfair, exhausting, but better. When Itachi returned home that night, the house was awake in fragments. Mikoto sorting something in the next room. Fugaku in low discussion with a clan messenger whose concerns sounded irritating rather than dire. Sasuke fighting sleep with the moral outrage of a child convinced rest was a plot against his interests. Everything ordinary. Everything worth an entire continent, if the continent was honest. He sat with Sasuke until the boy finally surrendered to sleep, still trying to form one last sentence around some minor victory from earlier in the day. The half-finished pride of it, the refusal to let even exhaustion fully interrupt becoming, that was Sasuke. Not yet the boy who would one day demand recognition through rivalry sharpened into pain, just this child. Here, alive in a better world, not because destiny had softened, but because people had worked, chosen, and corrected. Afterward, Itachi stepped outside alone. Konoha at night carried a sound unlike any battlefield quiet, rooflines breathing, distant movement. Lives enclosed and continuing. A village not asleep, exactly, but trusting darkness enough to let the day loosen its hold. He stood there and looked across a place he had once saved by helping poison it, then spent years loving through distance because closeness hurt too much. Now closeness hurt for a better reason, because it had become real again. And beyond the village, beyond the route networks, and the hidden intermediaries, and the early diplomatic architecture, beyond even Orochimaru's hunger and Danzo's watchfulness, the largest shadow still waited. Akatsuki had not yet collided fully with this altered world. Obito had not yet made his decisive reach. The real pressure Hiruzen had named had only begun to gather. That was why this ending could not be a clean ending. Not because the story lacked shape. It had shape now, unmistakably. Itachi had come back from death. He had told the truth to the Hokage. The massacre had not happened. Naruto had been spared in early communal cruelty. The Uchiha remained integrated enough that their future no longer pointed obediently toward destruction. Team Anko had become a living corrective force in his life and, in their smaller way, in the village's wider awareness. The first threads of continental architecture had been laid under the cover of exams and ordinary diplomacy. A new world existed where before there had only been ruin waiting to happen. That was not nothing. It was immense. But it was not finished. Because the real test of architecture is never whether it can be drawn or even built. It is whether it holds when the weight finally arrives. Itachi looked out into the dark beyond Konoha and understood with complete clarity that they had bought something precious and terrible with all their success. A future worth attacking. And somewhere in that dark, sooner or later, the forces that had once devoured his first life would realize that the world they meant to consume had changed shape beneath them. When they did, there would be no more easy reliance on memory, no more comfort in simply knowing where tragedy had once fallen. There would only be this new structure, this new network of bonds, this fragile widening pocket of possibility, and the question of whether he, Hiruzen, his team, his family, and perhaps eventually others beyond Konoha, had built enough of a different world to survive the collision, he did not know. For the first time in a very long life, and a very strange second one, he accepted that not knowing without trying to kill hope in advance. That, perhaps, was the deepest change of all. Behind him, inside the house, Sasuke slept safely. Somewhere else in the village, Naruto still lived untouched by the old public hatred that had once bent his childhood around loneliness. In another home, Yigao was likely sharpening herself toward a future not yet lost to the village's hungers. Anko, damaged and defiant and more valuable than she understood, still stood between the next generation and some of the worst instincts that had shaped her. Hiruzen, burdened but awake in ways the old timeline had not permitted, continued building architecture in shadow because there was no honorable alternative left. And ahead, only ahead, waited the rest, not doom, not victory, the rest. Itachi let the night settle around him and, for once, did not force it to answer what it could not yet answer. He had started this life by waking into impossible mercy and asking why a man like him had been given another chance. Now standing on the threshold of a future, no one fully controlled anymore, he thought the better question might be this: what could a second chance become if enough people chose to build with it before the dark arrived? That question remained unanswered. But for the first time, the world around him felt large enough, alive enough, and changed enough that the answer did not have to be tragedy. To be continued,